Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity slows itself down and the night settles gently around ideas that once shaped entire civilizations. Tonight's quiet path leads towards something early. Cultures watched with a mix of confidence and unease. They raised their eyes to the stars not just for beauty or guidance, but because they believed the sky carried warnings. Among those cultures, the Sumerians left behind records that seemed to hint at an event that never actually arrived. They carved signs into clay as though the universe was preparing to shift, and they believed it was worth noting in detail. This time, the story is about whether an ancient people truly predicted something vast, something that has yet to occur, a cosmic impact that lingers like a message waiting to be delivered. Here you are, settling into this calm corner of evening or night, and it's comforting to share a moment before ideas begin to stretch out. The world is still for a little while, and this space becomes steady enough for long thoughts. If this soft way of exploring helps you feel at ease or drifts you closer to rest, it would mean a lot if you gave the video a like or subscribed. The support helps this place remain a quiet sanctuary for anyone who enjoys drifting through old knowledge at an unhurried pace. The story begins slowly, the way all stories about the distant past tend to do, because the first traces of Sumerian sky watching were not grand revelations but small scratches in clay. They lived in a land shaped by rivers, surrounded by open plains that allowed the sky to dominate every horizon. When a world is so open, the sky becomes the most constant companion. The Sumerians did not treat it as a distant dome, but as a living place filled with moving parts. Stars shifted across seasons. The moon waxed, waned, and returned. Planets behaved differently from the background of fixed stars. Eclipses unsettled the rhythm of light. Each motion became part of an ongoing record, because they believed these motions carried meaning for the world below. Clay tablets from the early cities of Sumer carry long lists of signs tied to disturbances in the heavens. A sudden darkening of the sky was not simply a weather event. A streak of light was not simply a falling stone. A near approach of a brilliant body, even if only imagined or exaggerated over time, could be taken as a sign of major shift yet to come. The Sumerians built temples with high platforms not just to honour their gods, but to watch the sky with structure, with method, and with purpose. Over generations, these observations formed patterned expectations. When something unusual appeared above them, they did not only observe it, they recorded and interpreted it. In their world, everything above and everything below moved together. A strange light in the sky might be connected to unrest in a city, or the appointment of a ruler, or the health of crops, or the stability of rivers. Their system linked heaven and earth through chains of significance. This is part of why later scholars began wondering whether the Sumerians had left warnings about something larger than anything they could personally witness. Some tablets appear to describe the arrival of bright bodies that approach with heavy consequences. They mention debris, fire from the sky, and disturbances that could ripple across lands. These descriptions often carry an unmistakable structure, as if the scribes intended to catalogue possibilities rather than recount events they had survived. Over time, readers of these texts noticed something else. Some of the warnings referred to cycles and returns, as though a celestial visitor might come at long intervals, too long for any individual scribe to witness but still worth recording as tradition. This is where the idea of a predicted cosmic impact begins to form. If the Sumerians believed that certain omens came from returning bodies in the sky, then perhaps they were describing an event that had not yet arrived. Not something from memory, but something from pattern, or from fear, or from the logic of their omen system. Their omen series, especially those that were later compiled into large collections, often follow a formula that repeats signs and consequences in careful order. Some refer to objects bright enough to obscure other stars. Others describe fiery trails that pass across the sky for several days. These signs are linked to effects such as the destruction of regions, upheaval in leadership, or dramatic environmental change. While these consequences would have been framed symbolically at the time, Modern readers sometimes reinterpret them through scientific hindsight. A bright visitor in the sky followed by destruction sounds to modern ears like a comet or asteroid encounter. Yet the Sumerians were not merely writing about the sky as a backdrop for stories. They held long traditions of watching it precisely. Over hundreds of years, they documented the predictable motions of the moon and planets. They created lists of fixed stars and used these lists for timing and orientation. Their work laid the foundation for later Babylonian astronomy, which achieved levels of mathematical prediction that remain impressive even now. When a culture watches the sky with this much care for this long, small deviations become significant. This means that if they recorded something unusual, a rare approach of a bright object for example, it likely stood out from the routine. It becomes important to consider that many ancient civilizations witnessed comets or meteor storms, but not all of them integrated those events into structured predictions. The Sumerians did. They believed patterns repeated, even if separated by lifetimes. If a sign occurred once, it could occur again. They did not need to experience the event personally to write about its potential return. This provides a framework for understanding how a prediction of a cosmic visitor, possibly dangerous, could have entered their texts. Modern scholars who analyse these omen texts sometimes debate their meaning. Some argue that the references to fiery bodies are symbolic. Others point out that ancient scribes often blended real observations with mythic or religious interpretations. Still others believe the Sumerians may have genuinely recorded an object with an orbit long enough that later generations never saw it return. Even the possibility of such an object creates room for speculation. If something approached once and left a strong impression on a knowledgeable group of sky watchers, then their expectation of a return might feel natural to them. Over centuries, those expectations could become predictions, and if that predicted return never came, it would remain preserved as an unresolved entry in their records. In examining why this idea continues to intrigue people today, it helps to look at the way the Sumerians organized knowledge. They catalogued patterns rather than isolated events. A single observation did not stand alone but became part of a larger system of meaning. When a bright object crossed the sky, the scribes compared it to previous entries. They added details about its direction, brightness, and duration. If the object returned, or if a similar one later appeared, they updated their entries accordingly. This cumulative habit allowed them to create long lines of interpretation. Even if a future event never arrived, the expectation of it remained. Some early records describe what appears to be a fiery body crossing the sky from one horizon to another. Whether this was a comet with an unusually close approach, a bolide that fragmented dramatically, or a literary description shaped by cultural beliefs, it became incorporated into later omen series as an example of a dangerous celestial sign. When a phenomenon is framed as dangerous, it becomes something to watch for again. Over centuries, these warnings expanded. They became part of an inherited memory that reached far beyond any individual's lifetime. The belief that the sky could send destruction was not exclusive to Sumer, but the Sumerians wrote about it in a format that preserved the idea with remarkable endurance. Their texts survived through countless generations, copied and recopied, each time slightly adjusted to match the concerns of the era. Some tablets from later periods include lines describing a potential future event involving a massive object or a disturbance from above that could alter the land. These lines do not specify a date or even a clear description, but they imply anticipation. They imply a belief that something had been expected and had not yet arrived. It becomes easier to understand why modern interpretations occasionally drift toward the idea of a cosmic impact that remains unrealized. The Sumerians did not separate the natural and supernatural the way later cultures did. A celestial visitor could be both an object and a sign. A comet could be real and symbolic at the same time. A meteor storm could be viewed as a shower of messages. This dual meaning creates an interpretive gap. Modern readers tend to favour physical explanations, while the original scribes favoured relational ones. Somewhere between these approaches lies the possibility that a real astronomical event inspired a prediction that carried more weight than the event itself. One element often cited in these discussions is the presence of recurring descriptions that resemble long-period comets. These comets could appear once and then return only after many centuries. If a particularly bright one passed close enough to be memorable, it might become embedded in tradition. Later generations, who never witnessed the return, might still believe one was due. This belief could then influence the way omens were framed and how anxieties about the future were recorded. When a culture with a strong record-keeping tradition expects something, that expectation leaves traces. At times, these records describe objects trailing light across the night for multiple days. This does not necessarily require an enormous object. Even moderate comets can maintain long visible tails, especially if dust production is high or if the angle of the sun illuminates them strongly. But to a culture that viewed the sky as a system of messages, such a sight could be significant enough to anchor predictions. When the object faded, the memory did not fade with it. Scribes continue to reference it in their omen lists, noting possible consequences if such a visitor returned. In later periods, when Babylonian astronomy became more formalized, some references to bright visitors persist but become more mathematically framed. This suggests the idea survived long after the original observation. If the Sumerians had predicted a cosmic visitor that could cause destruction, even symbolically, later writers continued to preserve that prediction. What remains unclear is whether they believed the event was imminent or simply possible. Ancient texts often blend certainty and caution, leaving room for multiple interpretations. Some modern readers have connected these predictions to broader theories about catastrophic cycles or lost astronomical knowledge. These ideas range from cautious speculation to imaginative narratives. However, the simplest explanation often holds the most stability. The Sumerians saw something unusual. They recorded it. They believed it could return. Their system encouraged them to treat such a return as significant. That significance became part of the record and persisted across generations. Whether the event was real or symbolic, the expectation remained. The calm pace of this exploration reflects the steady nature of ancient record-keeping. Nothing rushed. Every entry mattered. Every sign belonged somewhere. When modern readers study these tablets, they often sense the weight of that patience. A single line carved into clay could carry centuries of meaning. The thought that something large might once have approached from the sky becomes easier to accept when reading texts written by a culture that watched the sky carefully and cared deeply about what it meant. Even now, the idea continues because the Sumerians wrote with a seriousness that gives their predictions a long lifespan. They lived in a world where the present moment felt linked to distant events. Their records keep that link alive, even when the predicted event has not arrived. Whether a cosmic impact was truly foreseen or merely imagined through patterns and tradition, the expectation itself shaped their texts. As time flows forward in this calm setting, the path leads naturally toward understanding how a prediction could form before predictive science existed. The next part will move into that early sky-watching mindset, long before patterns were formalized, when the first observers stood beneath a wide horizon and tried to make sense of what moved above them, carrying the weight of an idea that would shape their writings for generations. Long before clay tablets accumulated careful rows of symbols, long before any organized system linked a flicker in the sky to a consequence on the ground, people in the region that would become Sumer were already paying attention to the heavens. They lived in landscapes where the sky opened in every direction. There were no tall forests blocking the horizon, and no mountains rising sharply above them. The world spread out in a way that emphasized the dome above more than the land itself. With so much of life tied to seasonal change, river behavior, and the dependable movements of celestial bodies, the first observers learned to watch the sky not as an occasional curiosity, but as a constant measure of order. The earliest communities settled near the rivers because water shaped every choice they made. The rivers rose, fell, twisted, and wandered across the plains. When they behaved normally, people adjusted comfortably. When they behaved unexpectedly, people noticed. In time, these communities learned that the sky often delivered hints about the behaviour of the land. The first watchers were not astronomers. They were farmers, fishers, and workers who needed to know the rhythm of the world. Their attention gradually shifted upward because the cycle of the heavens offered steadier signals than anything on the ground. The movements of the moon and stars repeated with dependable timing. The sun returned each morning with an unwavering commitment. The seasonal constellations marched in steady arcs. In a world where the land could surprise them, the sky gave a sense of predictability. Still, predictability was not guaranteed. The sky had its own disruptions. Bright streaks appeared without warning. Objects glowed where no star had been before. The moon occasionally darkened. The sun sometimes dimmed in the middle of the day. These early disruptions unsettled communities because they stood out against the usual patterns. A regular rhythm interrupted by a sudden unfamiliar visitor created a sense of imbalance. Storied landscapes could shift, but the sky was supposed to remain consistent. When it didn't, people remembered. The first minds who watched closely were not interpreting the sky through mathematics or formula. They relied on repetition, patience, and collective memory. Night after night, certain stars returned to the same positions. Seasons aligned with specific constellations. Winds changed with predictable timing. These watchers noticed the slow drift of the solar year long before they understood it. They built calendars slowly, not with tools but with lived experience. When the Nile-like rivers rose each year, they connected the event to the cycle of the sky above them. When seasonal winds changed direction, they connected that shift to the arc of the sun across the horizon. Within these communities, certain individuals began paying attention more systematically. They lingered outside longer after dusk. They watched the transition from twilight into night as though it carried messages. They memorized the first star to appear at certain points of the year. Over generations, these habits became traditions. Traditions became roles. Someone who paid attention consistently began to earn respect. Not because they held supernatural power, but because their memory was reliable. When a person could recall that a certain pattern had occurred during a previous season, others began to rely on them. These early observers noticed small deviations long before they wrote anything down. A star might appear slightly brighter one season, or a faint streak might glide across the darkness. The moon occasionally appeared with unusual coloration. A cluster of stars might seem displaced due to atmospheric conditions. To a careful observer, these small deviations mattered. They widened the scope of what the sky could do. The more the sky revealed, the more it seemed to hold. This slow shift in awareness formed the early groundwork for prediction. People did not yet expect the sky to deliver warnings, but they understood that it could behave in unexpected ways. When something unusual happened once, it became memorable. When it happened twice, it gained significance. If it ever returned after many seasons, the watchers considered it part of a larger pattern. And once a pattern existed, even if only loosely understood, it became something worth passing down. These first observers did not divide the heavens into strict regions. They tracked positions relative to familiar landmarks on the ground. A bright object might rise near a particular hill, or pass above a recognizable bend in the river. The land became a frame for the sky. Over time, humans began to invert this relationship. Instead of the land framing the sky began framing the land. When the sun sat at a certain point on the horizon, a season began. When the moon rose in a particular phase at a particular time, communities prepared for specific cycles of planting or harvest. The sky became not only a source of information but a structure for living. When an unusual visitor appeared, something large enough or bright enough to disrupt the normal pattern, early observers took note. A comet folding across the night, even a small one, captured attention easily. A bright meteor exploding overhead left an unforgettable impression. The experience of such an event burned itself into memory because it contradicted the usual calm. These events created the earliest seeds of anticipation. If something unpredictable had happened once, people began watching for it again. The watchers who remembered the first occurrence felt responsibility for the second. This sense of responsibility gradually created the foundation for early omen interpretation. A bright object might not have caused harm directly, but its arrival could be associated with changes in weather or disruptions on the ground. These associations did not come from superstition alone. Early communities often experienced hardships in clusters. A sudden shift in climate, a dry season, a change in river flooding patterns, or a conflict between groups could occur near the same time as an unusual sky event. Without written records to separate coincidence from connection, the associations grew naturally. Slowly, the watchers began linking sky disturbances to events on Earth. If a bright visitor appeared in the sky during a year of poor harvest, that object might be remembered as part of the cause. If storms arrived unexpectedly after a meteor shower, that timing could be interpreted as significant. Over time, early people built chains of meaning that tied the heavens to the land in ways that felt sensible to them. These chains did not require precision. They required memory, experience, and a desire to understand why things happened. As communities grew into larger settlements, the watchers became more specialized. People built structures to help mark celestial positions. Elevated platforms allowed observers to track the horizon without obstruction. Angled walls captured the rising sun on specific days. Stone markers aligned with seasonal events. This was not yet formal astronomy, but a steady movement toward it. The sky was no longer simply observed. It was studied. As study deepened, so did interpretation. The first watchers did not separate natural events from meaningful ones. Every unusual movement carried potential significance. If an object passed close enough to be memorable, observers compared it to previous events. If the object differed from anything in memory, it took on extra weight. The watchers discussed what it might mean within their communities. Because they lacked strict categories, the idea of prediction entered this process naturally. If something unusual signaled something important in the past, it might signal something important in the future. This mindset laid the groundwork for the idea of cosmic visitors that mattered. It was during this era of early observation that the seeds of later Sumerian ideas began to grow. The earliest communities in the region saw the sky as a dynamic partner rather than a distant spectacle. They recognized patterns long before they named them. They responded to disruptions long before they catalogued them. Their lives depended on anticipating the next shift in season or river, and the sky became a central tool for anticipating these shifts. Over generations, people began storing observations in more stable forms. Marks on clay or stone allowed communities to preserve knowledge longer than memory alone. A record of an unusual visitor could survive the life of a watcher. A later observer could read the mark, compare it to a current event, and draw a connection. Each preserved observation strengthened the idea that sky disturbances had lasting importance. When a culture begins to believe that unusual events hold meaning, prediction becomes part of its worldview. Early watchers did not yet produce detailed warnings, but they carried the conviction that the sky had something to say. Every unusual movement became a possibility rather than an isolated moment. These possibilities accumulated. The sky seemed larger because it held more potential outcomes. When people treat the sky as a communicator, the idea of receiving messages grows naturally. This early mindset shaped the future development of omen traditions. Once people believed that the sky could signal change, they began searching for these signals. A watcher's role expanded from observing to anticipating. The weight of this anticipation affected how they interpreted normal events. Even subtle variations became sources of meaning. A streak of light, a shift in the colour of the horizon, or the unexpected appearance of a faint object could become significant in a system shaped by constant attention. It is within this careful attention that the roots of long-term prediction formed. Even without advanced astronomy, early watchers understood that some celestial movements repeated on long cycles. The moon repeated monthly, the sun repeated yearly. Planets moved in recognizable rhythms. Observing these cycles allowed communities to trust the stability of the world. When these cycles broke briefly, the disruption felt profound. If a celestial object appeared once and then did not return within the expected time, watchers assumed it might come back much later. This assumption created room for the idea of future events beyond immediate lifetimes. These early minds had no reason to dismiss long intervals. Their world moved slowly. Seasons took months to change. Rivers followed long cycles. Generations passed before structures shifted. Time felt expansive, not rushed. A celestial visitor that might return after centuries still fit within their worldview. The Watchers understood that important things could occur long after their own lives ended. This understanding strengthened the idea that predictions could extend across generations. As communities refined record-keeping, these early observations began forming the base of what would later become structured omen series. The first Watchers did not use formal categories, but later cultures built categories around their observations. The Watchers who paid attention too carefully laid the foundation for a tradition that interpreted every unusual event as part of an interconnected system. When later scribes created organized lists of celestial signs and their consequences, they drew on traditions that began long before writing existed. The first Watchers looked up at a sky that seemed clear and expansive, yet it held more variability than they expected. Their careful recording of anomalies laid the groundwork for a worldview in which prediction became a natural expectation. This worldview made it possible for later generations to believe that a cosmic visitor, perhaps dangerous, might one day return. The Watchers did not know they were shaping predictions. They were simply responding to the world around them with the tools they had: patience, attention, memory, and a deep awareness of how much they did not yet understand. As the narrative continues, the path moves toward the development of actual written tablets and the first structured attempts to record not just what the sky did, but what it might mean. The early Watchers passed their role to dedicated scribes who began to shape their observations into systems that would influence entire cultures. The next stage follows the formation of those texts and how they began turning sky events into detailed warnings that form the early outline of a prediction that still lingers in modern discussions. When writing first emerged in ancient Mesopotamia, it did not begin with stories or long histories. It began with accounting, measurement, and the tracking of goods. Clay served as a record of grain, livestock, labour, and trade, but clay soon carried far more than numbers. As the early cities grew in complexity, the desire to capture the rhythms of the sky found its way into these same tablets. The first Watchers had relied on memory and repetition, passing observations through spoken tradition. Once writing was established, those same observations gained permanence. Clay became an extension of the night sky, a surface where the movements of the heavens could be stored and re-examined by generations that would never meet the original observers. In this shift, a subtle but powerful change occurred. Before writing, skywatching had been personal. Now it became institutional. Temples and administrative centres began keeping tablets that captured not just the daily flow of goods, but the rare interruptions that unsettled the sky's usual behaviour. A streak across the night, an unexpected dimming, a strange alignment, or a repeating disturbance gained a new shape when pressed into clay. A record created for practical purposes expanded into a tool for understanding events that stretched far beyond a single season. As more tablets accumulated, patterns began emerging among them. Observers noticed that certain words reappeared when describing unusual sights. They developed agreed-upon terms of various types of celestial disruptions. A bright visitor received one label, a long-tailed streak another, a sudden shadow a third. Over time, these descriptions grew more standardized. Once anything becomes standardized, it becomes easier to predict, or at least easier to categorize in a way that feels predictive. Clay gained a voice that allowed it to speak consistently across generations. Some of the earliest omen tablets formed naturally out of this process. The scribes who created them were not writing prophecies in the modern sense. They were recording possibilities. Their world moved through cycles that often felt stable until something interrupted that stability. A major flood, a harsh drought, a sudden change in the river's direction, or a shift in political control often occurred alongside notable sky events. When these events repeated across generations, clay tablets preserved the associations so thoroughly that they became part of the culture's interpretive framework. The language on these tablets is firm, structured, and detail-oriented. It avoids flourish because the scribes were not concerned with storytelling. They wanted to create lists that could be referenced quickly and understood without ambiguity. A typical line might describe a specific celestial phenomenon, followed by its assumed consequence. These pairings form the backbone of Mesopotamian divination. The sky was a ledger, and clay was the tool that helped balance it. When an observer saw something unusual overhead, the first instinct was to compare it to what previous generations had recorded. If a similar event had been noted in the past, the earlier consequences were applied. Whether or not the past correlation was meaningful did not matter as much as the continuity of the system. A young scribe trained in these methods learned to treat the sky as a structured field of signs. If a streak appeared too close to a constellation, it carried a documented meaning. If a temporary glow lingered near the horizon, the clay offered instructions for interpretation. This system expanded with every passing century. Tablets from different cities began referencing each other. Some entries grew longer, others became more specific. As the volume of material increased, scribes compiled the entries into larger collections. These collections would eventually form the basis for the Omen series that described everything from eclipses to the behaviour of planets and comets. These tablets showed how the sky interacted with the land and its people. Among these early collections, references to bright or unusual objects occupy a striking place. They are described with care and appear across multiple lists. Even small variations between tablets reveal how seriously the scribes regarded these events. They noted length, direction, intensity, duration, and the reaction of the surrounding stars. Each detail helped maintain a record that stretched beyond any one lifetime. The goal was not only to understand what had happened, but to prepare future generations for the return of similar events. The Omen tablets did not focus on prediction in the modern scientific sense. They focused on establishing consequences based on precedent. If a bright object crossed the sky and a major political shift occurred in the same year, the event and the consequence were linked. This approach shaped how communities responded to unusual celestial occurrences. The more spectacular the event, the more widely the associated omens spread. When a fiery object was recorded even once, it entered the omen tradition with enough seriousness that later generations treated it as a potential future signal. It is within this tradition that descriptions of falling worlds or skyborne disturbances became embedded in the clay. The scribes who wrote these entries may not have witnessed the original events, but they inherited the memory through a chain of earlier tablets. The phrasing on some of these records implies a mixture of awe and caution. A large body moving across the night sky was not simply an isolated visual event. It was a disruption with weight, something significant enough to deserve its own category. Some entries describe objects that move slowly enough to track over several nights. Others mention fast-moving streaks with trailing light. Still others speak of sudden brightness that seemed to emerge without warning. These descriptions show that ancient observers were attentive to detail. A long-tailed object required different interpretation from a single-point flash. A lingering glow suggested something different from a sharp streak. Over time, these categories deepened, and the potential consequences listed beside them diversified. It is important to understand that the omen tablets did not attempt to separate physical events from symbolic interpretation. The physical description created the foundation, while the associated meaning built the structure. When later generations examined these entries, they encountered detailed accounts of objects that may have been comets, meteor showers, or large bolides. To the scribes, each event implied something beyond the physical. Modern readers often try to extract the literal element, isolating the astronomical core from the symbolic frame. The original text did not operate under that division. Among the most intriguing entries are those that describe large, bright visitors that appear to move independently of known planetary paths. The tablets sometimes specify changes in brightness across several days, as well as notes on direction and apparent size. Although these descriptions lack the precision of later Babylonian astronomical records, they still present a recognizable picture of what might have been a comet with a close approach, or an unusually large meteor that fragmented overhead. In some cases, the consequences attached to these events include widespread upheaval, agricultural disruption, or visible damage to the land. These consequences may have been symbolic, but they occasionally resemble the aftermath of energetic atmospheric bursts or meteor impacts. The omen tablets blend memory with interpretation, and this combination allowed unusual events to take on a scale larger than life. Over many generations, descriptions of significant sky events became increasingly dramatic. When a scribe copied an earlier tablet, subtle changes often slipped into the text. A particularly bright object might grow larger in the retelling. A dramatic streak might become a more prolonged disturbance. The lack of firm boundaries between observation and interpretation allowed traditions to accumulate layers. Each layer deepened the significance of the event being described. By the time these entries reached the height of Mesopotamian scholarship, they had taken on a monumental quality. This layering is part of what leads modern researchers to consider whether some descriptions point toward genuine astronomical events. A single observation can transform into a long-standing expectation once embedded in a system of omens. If an event occurred generations before, with effects or perceived consequences that shaped a community, the record of that event would hold a unique place in memory. Later scribes, reading these accounts, might assume the event occurred on a cycle, even if no cycle existed. This assumption could lead to a belief that the event would return. The most striking lines within these tablets describe sky events that seem incomplete. The tablets list the sign but leave the expectation open. This sense of incompleteness fuels the modern idea that the Sumerians predicted a cosmic impact that has not yet occurred. Some entries speak of a large object that passes close but does not strike, followed by warnings about what might happen at the next appearance. Whether the original observer believed in a cycle or simply wanted to record a possibility, the text leaves a lasting impression. The clay itself preserves these impressions with remarkable clarity. The act of pressing a stylus into wet clay creates a permanence that spoken tradition could not match. Once a line became part of the omen tradition, it remained there until scribes deliberately removed it. Most entries were copied faithfully for centuries. This continuity gave even hypothetical possibilities the appearance of long-term expectation. A scribe reading a line about a dangerous celestial visitor might assume it came from concrete experience, even if the truth was less certain. Some tablets also reference disturbances that appear to involve fire falling from the sky or fragments scattering across the land. These entries employ practical language that suggests real memory rather than symbolic invention. Events similar to modern-day meteor bursts or air explosions might have left enough sensory impact to inspire such descriptions. If the event was witnessed by many people, it would naturally enter the omen tradition with significant weight. As the omen system expanded, scholars of the time began organizing tablets into large series. These series grew into structured collections that formed the backbone of later Babylonian divination. The sections related to sky events included both common and rare occurrences. Eclipses dominated some sections, planetary movements filled others, but the rare and dramatic entries about bright visitors, fiery disturbances, or near encounters held a different position. They were set apart by their tone and by the gravity assigned to their consequences. Over centuries, these dramatic entries shaped the idea that the sky held the potential to disrupt life on Earth in profound ways. Once written, the idea became self-sustaining. A future scribe reading an entry about a fiery visitor would prepare to record its next return if such an event occurred. The absence of a return did not erase the expectation. It simply extended it further. This extension forms a key part of why modern researchers still discuss the possibility that ancient Mesopotamians predicted a future cosmic encounter. The clay carries the expectation forward regardless of whether the event materialized. The most compelling aspect of these tablets is not the specific predictions, but the system that produced them. The omen tradition treated the sky as an organized structure of signs. When something outside the usual pattern appeared, it had to be placed within that structure. A large comet or meteor burst could fit only into the most serious categories, where predictions had long-term implications. This placement created an impression of cycles even if no cycle existed. Once categorized, the event remained part of the system indefinitely. The continuity of the omen tradition also meant that each interpretation gained weight through repetition. If a line was copied through several centuries, the significance attributed to it increased. Even small details took on authority simply because they had survived time. A line describing a fiery object might lose its original context, but the authority of tradition kept it active in the interpretive structure. This layering of meaning and tradition set the stage for the later belief that some celestial events followed long intervals. Over time, the concept of cycles became stronger. Celestial bodies that behave predictably reinforced the idea. Planetary movements and lunar cycles provided a model for returning visitors. If the known bodies moved on cycles, it seemed reasonable to assume that unusual visitors might do the same. This assumption allowed predictions to reach beyond the scribe's lifetime. The omen tablets speak most clearly through the structure of their entries. The clay does not exaggerate with emotion. It offers direct lines that describe events and consequences. Despite this simplicity, the combined effect of thousands of lines creates a system that feels intricate and weighted. A modern reader often sees two layers at once, the literal layer describing sky events and the cultural layer interpreting what those events meant. As the narrative continues, the focus moves toward the sky that never stopped offering surprises. The watchers who inherited the omen tablets learned to treat every unexpected light as part of a larger pattern that stretched backward and forward through time. The next stage follows the objects that captured their attention most strongly, the bright visitors that moved across the night and encouraged entire cultures to imagine what might happen if they ever returned again. Long before astronomy became a defined discipline, long before any attempt at scientific modelling, the sky displayed a steady cycle of order, interrupted by rare moments of disruption. These disruptions were the events that early Mesopotamian communities remembered most clearly, because they broke the familiar rhythm that shaped their understanding of the world. Predictable movement created comfort. Unpredictable movement created caution. Over time, caution developed into interpretation, and interpretation formed the foundation for the belief that the sky was not merely a silent backdrop, but an active participant in human life. The appearance of comets, shadows, and other celestial visitors shaped that belief more than anything else. Night after night the stars held their positions with minimal change. Even when the constellations shifted through the seasons, their patterns stayed consistent. The moon repeated its cycle. The planets followed their wandering paths. These motions were stable enough that the first sky watchers built their understanding around them. The moments that disrupted this stability stood out with unusual force. A bright tail stretching across the sky, a sudden flash, or a darkening of the sun or moon created a gap in the expected pattern. The sky felt different during these moments. It behaved in a way that resisted simple explanation, and this created lasting impressions that survived for generations. Comets played a central role in shaping these impressions. A comet did not resemble any familiar star. It did not rise and set in a predictable manner. It did not follow the orderly motions of the planets. It appeared suddenly. It carried a hazy glow and a trailing tail that gave the impression of motion even when standing still. To an early observer, a comet felt alive, as though it had entered the sky intentionally. It drew attention through its strangeness, its brightness, and its unpredictable path. Communities gathered to watch it not because they understood it, but because they could not ignore it. Anything that disrupted the sky's usual calm demanded recognition. As writing developed and the omen tradition grew stronger, comets entered the clay record as significant entries. The scribes who documented them treated them with a seriousness that stood apart from other observations. A comet that spanned several nights became a recordable event. A comet that lingered longer became a matter of concern. The longer it remained visible, the more often people returned to observe it, and the more connections they drew between its presence and the events unfolding around them. Even if unrelated, these events formed associations in the minds of observers. Once an association formed, it gained permanence through repetition. Not all comets appeared with dramatic tails, but even smaller ones could disturb the regular pattern of the night sky. Some comets brightened unexpectedly, others dimmed in uneven ways. These variations added to their mysterious nature. For a scribe committed to documenting deviations from the norm, a comet's unpredictable behaviour made it significant. Clay tablets often describe comets with direct and simple phrasing, emphasizing their sudden appearance, length of visibility, or unexpected brightness. The language is measured, yet it conveys a sense of encountering something important. Meteor showers and bolides added another layer to this developing system of meaning. A meteor shower produced numerous streaks across the sky within a short period. Each streak might last only a moment, but the collective effect created an impression that something was falling from above. To ancient observers, this appearance of falling lights carried immediate weight. Even small meteor showers could evoke a sense of disruption, because they occurred without warning and vanished quickly. The short-lived nature of these events may have made them even more memorable. Something that appears suddenly and disappears just as quickly lingers in collective memory more strongly than a stable phenomenon. Larger meteors or bolides amplified this impression further. A bright fireball streaking across the sky or fragmenting overhead created a sound, a flash, or even a momentary brightening of the landscape. These rare events left a deep mark on observers. The shock of witnessing such an occurrence would naturally lead to attempts at explanation. Without the tools to understand atmospheric entry or fragmentation, ancient communities linked these events to other disruptions occurring around them. If a major political change happened within the same season, observers might form an interpretive link. If a harvest failed during the same year, the memory of the fireball merged with the memory of the hardship. These interpretations entered the clay record gradually. Early tablets might reference a bright flash or a falling star without assigning it a fixed consequence. Later tablets built on earlier entries, adding layers of interpretation. Over time, certain phrases became standard. A bright visitor suggested disturbance. A falling light suggested disruption. A lingering glow suggested imbalance. These patterns accumulated and solidified into the omen system, giving the sky a reputation for warning humanity through visible signs. Eclipses added a different dimension to this framework. Unlike comets or meteors, eclipses followed predictable cycles, though early observers did not yet understand these cycles fully. When the sun dimmed unexpectedly, or the moon darkened in the middle of the night, the entire community felt the disturbance. The sun was the steady anchor of daily life. Any interruption to its light demanded attention. Lunar eclipses produced a similar reaction. The moon's slow darkening, sometimes accompanied by a reddish hue, created a sense of change that felt unnatural. These events entered the omen tradition not because they threatened physical harm, but because they disrupted the rhythm that communities relied on for stability. The combination of all these phenomena formed a sky that seemed active, restless, and full of signals. Even though most nights passed without incident, the rare events overshadowed the ordinary ones. A comet that remained visible for weeks became a major point of conversation. A meteor burst captured attention through its sudden brilliance. An eclipse gave the impression of something powerful passing between humanity and the heavens. These moments shaped both personal memory and cultural tradition. As cities grew and scribes refined their craft, the omen tablets absorbed these sky events into a structured system. By the time the Omen series reached later stages of development, references to comets, meteors, shadows, and bright visitors had become regular elements. The sky became a complex field of indicators. Scribes treated it as a surface that displayed information for those patient enough to interpret it. This approach reinforced the belief that the sky did not simply hold stars and planets, but possibilities and warnings. One of the most striking elements of this developing tradition was the belief that rare sky events were extensions of cosmic order rather than random occurrences. If the sky produced a comet once, it could produce it again. If a meteor shower appeared during a particular season, that season gained an association with falling lights. Even if the event did not repeat within the same century, the clay preserved the expectation. When the next scribe encountered a similar disturbance, they compared it to earlier entries. The act of comparison strengthened the idea of a larger pattern. From pattern came prediction. From prediction came meaning. This mindset created an environment in which the idea of returning cosmic visitors became natural. If a comet appeared and caused sufficient impression, the tradition could assume it followed a long cycle. Whether or not the cycle was real did not matter as much as the structure that allowed such assumptions to form. The structure provided a way to organize events that occurred too rarely for direct experience. When the clay suggested that a bright visitor had appeared in the past, observers expected it to appear again. This expectation became embedded in the omen tradition. Some tablets describe objects that appear to pass close to the earth or move across the sky at unusual angles. These descriptions may refer to comets with eccentric orbits, bright bolides entering the atmosphere, or even unusual atmospheric phenomena. The scribes captured them with consistent language that emphasized direction, brightness, and duration. These details helped integrate the events into the larger system of meaning. Even if the scribes lacked the tools to explain the physical nature of these objects, they documented them carefully enough that the descriptions still resonate with modern readers. These events collectively shaped the belief that the sky carried warnings. The warnings were not framed as direct predictions, but as associations that could indicate shifts in human affairs. This worldview gave weight to the idea that the sky could foreshadow significant events. When a bright visitor appeared, it suggested the possibility of future disruption. When that visitor did not return within the expected time, the expectation simply shifted forward. A missed return did not weaken the system. It expanded it. The sky became a place where timelines stretched beyond the limits of individual lifetimes. The belief in cosmic visitors that held long-term significance grew stronger as scribes accumulated more entries. Some tablets reference objects that appear at long intervals, though the intervals are often implied rather than stated. These entries leave space for interpretation. A later scribe might assume the object followed a cycle even if no cycle was known. This assumption could create a sense of anticipation that carried forward across generations. When the omen tradition preserved these entries, the anticipation became part of the cultural memory. Meteorites that reached the ground added another layer to this dynamic. Although rare, such events left physical traces that communities could examine. The presence of an unusual stone that did not resemble local material created both curiosity and concern. These stones often entered religious contexts or administrative collections. They reinforced the belief that the sky could send physical objects as well as visual signals. A stone that fell from above became evidence that the sky interacted with the earth in tangible ways. This strengthened the idea that cosmic visitors could pose real consequences. Over time, all these elements formed a sky that felt alive. Comets, meteors, fireballs, eclipses, and rare atmospheric events created a sequence of disturbances that communities could not ignore. The omen tablets preserved these disturbances in structured form. Once preserved, they gained authority. Once they gained authority, they influenced how future sky events were understood. The repetition of interpretation across centuries created a sense of continuity that stretched across cultures, even as political systems shifted and cities rose and fell. This continuity also created the conditions for the belief that an expected cosmic visitor had not yet arrived. If past events left strong impressions and were preserved as warnings, the absence of their return did not diminish the warning. It reinforced the sense that the event could still occur at some unknown time. The clay preserved possibilities with the same firmness that it preserved facts. For ancient scribes, the distinction did not matter as much as the system that required both to be recorded. As this narrative moves forward, the next stage explores how these sky events shape the deeper cultural meanings behind cosmic warnings. The watchers did not merely observe, and the scribes did not merely record. They created an expanding framework that connected celestial disturbances to the forces that shaped human life. This framework added depth to the idea that falling worlds were more than brilliant lights. They were signs within a long and evolving tradition that continued to grow with every recorded event. As omen traditions expanded and the clay tablets filled with careful lines describing unusual lights and shadows, the communities of ancient Mesopotamia carried an underlying belief that these events did not speak for themselves. The lights across the sky, the darkening of the moon, the sudden appearance of a bright visitor overhead, all had meanings that extended beyond the observation. The early watchers had taken the first steps toward identifying patterns, but the scribes and priests who inherited their records shaped those patterns into an interpretive system that touched every corner of life. In this system, the gods occupied a central position. They were not distant figures operating independently of the world. They were woven into every movement of the sky. When an unusual event appeared overhead, it felt natural for people to assume that the gods were making their intentions visible. For the early cities, the sky held as much authority as their temples. The world could change quickly, and stability depended on understanding what the forces around them intended. These forces were not abstract concepts. They were personified through deities who governed natural cycles, social order, and the shifting fortunes of kings. Each major city had its patron god, and each god held a defined sphere of influence. These spheres often aligned with natural elements, and the sky represented the most expansive domain of all. Any disturbance above was interpreted as part of a broader communication, because the people who lived under this sky believed their gods spoke through visible changes. The temples became the centres of this interpretive work. Priests trained to read tablets and observe the heavens carried the responsibility of explaining events that ordinary citizens did not fully understand. When a comet appeared, people looked to the temples for guidance. When a bright streak crossed the night sky, priests consulted clay records to determine what it meant. This interpretation shaped both the emotional and political responses to celestial disturbances. What began as simple observations centuries earlier became an organised system of meaning that linked cosmic movement with human affairs. This system added weight to the idea that the gods pointed upward at moments of significance. When the sky behaved in unusual ways, the gods were believed to be directing attention toward the source of an impending change. A bright object approaching from an unexpected direction could suggest a shift in leadership or a shift in fortune. A shadow over the sun could indicate difficulty for the land. A disturbance in the moon's appearance might imply tension in the coming months. These interpretations were not random. They grew from a long tradition of pairing events in the sky with changes on the ground. Over generations, this tradition built a framework that felt reliable enough for entire cities to depend on. In this environment, fear became a rational response. Fear did not arise from misunderstanding the sky, but from believing that the sky revealed truths that demanded attention. The gods were not arbitrary. They communicated through signs. Seeing a sign meant preparing for what followed. This did not make celestial events purely negative. Many signs carried positive interpretations. A particular planetary alignment might indicate harmony. A consistent pattern in the stars might suggest a prosperous season. Some comets were viewed with neutrality or even cautious optimism. But because the rarest sky events tended to accompany meaningful historical shifts, they carried a reputation for signalling disruption. These disruptions did not need to be catastrophic. The fall of a dynasty, the rise of a new king, or the success of a distant rival all counted as significant events. A comet that appeared during a period of political tension gained a reputation that could last for centuries. Even if the comet returned long after the political situation changed, the clay tablets preserved the association. Future scribes reading these records expected the comet to bring similar consequences. The expectation added pressure to interpret any rare event as meaningful. The scribes did not invent these meanings arbitrarily. They worked within a system that their culture had embraced fully. The belief that the gods used the sky as a means of communication strengthened the idea that cosmic visitors carried intent. A bright object did not drift across the heavens without purpose. It signalled action. It indicated that something larger than the human world was shifting. Even though the appearance of comets followed natural orbits and cycles, the observers who lived without that knowledge framed these returns as deliberate messages. The sky felt orderly except when it wished to speak. This perspective made every disturbance valuable, and every disturbance something worth documenting. The fear associated with these events was not uncontrolled panic. It was structured, organised, and absorbed into daily life through ritual. When a major sky event occurred, temples offered instructions for how communities should respond. Rituals helped maintain balance. Offerings helped restore stability. Administrative decisions followed the interpretations of the priests. The rituals did not erase fear. They managed it. The people believed they had a role in shaping how the gods responded to their interpretations. This belief allowed them to navigate the unknown with a sense of continuity. Despite the seriousness that accompanied these events, the omen system also created opportunities for reflection. The scribes who documented cosmic visitors had to decide how each event fit into the structure of their records. They learned from earlier entries while understanding that the sky also produced new forms of disruptions. This balance between tradition and observation gave the system flexibility. When a comet appeared that differed from earlier descriptions, the scribes noted the difference. If the comet's brightness varied or if its path changed direction unexpectedly, the omen tradition adjusted to include it. This adaptability allowed the tradition to survive for centuries without collapsing under its own weight. The fear associated with cosmic disturbances stemmed partly from their unpredictability. The people of ancient Mesopotamia understood cycles for the moon, the sun, and the planets, long before they understood the nature of comets or meteors. They relied on predictable patterns to plan their lives. When an unpredictable visitor disrupted the familiar pattern, it forced people to confront the possibility that the world contained forces beyond their control. This awareness shaped their relationship with the gods. The gods were not distant figures observing the world in silence. They were active participants who used the sky to reveal their presence. The priests who studied the omen tablets played a critical role in shaping this relationship. Their interpretations created a bridge between the unknown and the understandable. When a bright visitor appeared, it did not remain an isolated observation. It entered a structured narrative that guided how the community responded. The priests often consulted earlier tablets to find parallels. A comet described centuries before could help interpret the new one. Even if the circumstances differed, the clay preserved enough detail to guide the interpretation. This reliance on earlier records is one of the reasons the omen system gained such longevity. Clay does not decay quickly in the dry Mesopotamian climate. A tablet written in one era could survive long enough to influence scribes centuries later. This continuity created a sense of inherited fear, a fear shaped by generations who had witnessed events no longer remembered directly. The fear itself was not uncontrolled. It was structured and supported by ritual and tradition. But its presence influenced how people understood the sky. The gods were believed to coordinate these events in ways that aligned with human experiences. If a comet appeared during a time of conflict, the gods were believed to be expressing displeasure or signalling further unrest. If an unusual shadow crossed the moon during a period of uncertainty, the shadow became a marker of the uncertainty, even if the events were unrelated in a physical sense. The association strengthened the belief that the gods communicated through the sky. This belief took on a deeper dimension when combined with the idea that the sky held repeating cycles. If an event had occurred once and caused disruption, observers assumed it could occur again. This assumption became embedded in the omen system. When the omen tablets described a bright object appearing at long intervals, the scribes who copied these entries did not question the length of time involved. They worked within a worldview that accepted long cycles naturally. Generations passed without direct evidence of a returning visitor, but the clay preserved the expectation. The scribes believed they were participating in a tradition that extended across countless years. This belief positioned the sky as a timeline that stretched far beyond human memory. The gods were not limited by human lifespans. Their messages could span centuries. A comet that appeared once might not return for hundreds of years, yet the tradition maintained its significance through the records. This contributed to the fear associated with cosmic visitors. The fear did not arise solely from the events themselves, but from the possibility that the gods had planned something for a distant future. The expectation that a significant sky event might shape the world at an unknown time created a lingering sense of anticipation. The meaning assigned to these events varied depending on context. In some periods, a comet might represent the downfall of a ruler. In other periods, it might symbolically represent a shift in the natural world. These interpretations allowed for flexibility, which kept the system relevant. The fear associated with these interpretations was not rooted in superstition. It was rooted in experience. People had seen how quickly the world could change. They understood that the arrival of an unfamiliar cosmic visitor did not need to cause physical harm to influence their lives. The belief that the gods pointed upward at such moments reinforced the idea that these events carried purpose. Purpose gave the sky power. Power created the conditions for caution. Caution shaped the way people interpreted even minor disturbances. A faint glow on the horizon, or a short-lived streak across the night, became part of a larger system that connected the heavens to the land. The system created order in a world that often felt unstable. It offered explanations when explanations were difficult to find. It allowed people to respond to uncertainty with a sense of structure. This structure contributed directly to the belief that certain cosmic visitors had yet to return. If the omen tablets referenced an earlier event with significant consequences, and if no subsequent event matched it, the expectation of a future return persisted. The gods did not need to send signs frequently. One sign preserved in clay could shape expectations for centuries. The fear associated with that sign remained active as long as the tradition remained active. This narrative continues by following how this framework influenced later interpretations. The meaning assigned to cosmic events expanded as the sky revealed more unusual phenomena. As scribes recorded these events with increasing detail, the idea that the sky might shape the future gained strength. The next stage explores the patterns and cycles that the omen tradition believed it had discovered, and how these patterns contributed to the belief that a cosmic event predicted long ago still lingered on the horizon. The omen tradition that grew across early Mesopotamia eventually reached a point where the records did more than describe individual events. They began outlining patterns. The scribes believed the sky operated through cycles that extended across many generations. These cycles shaped their understanding of how the heavens behaved, and they influenced how the clay tablets were interpreted. The patterns did not need to be exact or mathematically precise to be meaningful. They carried weight because the system that produced them valued continuity more than accuracy. When observers noticed that certain types of events seemed to reappear at long intervals, they concluded that the sky worked through a rhythm that demanded recognition. The scribes inherited a world already filled with expectations. The moon adhered to a predictable path. The sun marked the seasons with reliability. The planets appeared in familiar relationships to the constellations. These regularities created the foundation for understanding the more unusual visitors. If the familiar bodies moved in recurring cycles, it felt reasonable to assume that unfamiliar ones did as well. Once the assumption existed, the omen tradition did not treat it as speculation. It treated it as structure. When a comet appeared and remained visible long enough to be remembered, the event did not fade after it vanished. It remained alive through the clay record. Later scribes studying these tablets assumed that each documented event represented part of a larger pattern. If an unusual object had once passed across the sky, the system implied it could return. The return did not require a defined interval. It simply needed to remain plausible. The tradition did not rely on strict calculations. It relied on the idea that the universe communicated through recurrence. This belief shaped how skywatchers interpreted the movements of bright visitors. Even if the original event was rare, the clay captured it in a way that made it part of the Omen series. Once included, it became part of a framework that expected repetition. Scribes wrote entries that combined observation with inherited meaning. If a comet appeared once in a century, that single event could create an interpretive pathway that lasted far longer than its visibility. Later, observers treated the entry as evidence that the sky sometimes produced catastrophic or transformative signs. The idea of cycles grew through accumulated memory. Certain phenomena appeared often enough for observers to recognize them. The regular return of eclipses, though not predictable in timing during the early periods, created the impression of an ongoing interplay between the sun and moon. The movement of planets through the zodiac offered long-term cycles that repeated predictably enough to reinforce a sense of order. Against this backdrop, a rare visitor appeared strange and meaningful. The more unique the event, the more significant it became within the Omen tradition. Some tablets describe objects returning unexpectedly after long absences. These references often lack detailed timelines, but they imply that the scribes believed certain cosmic disturbances followed intervals too long for any one person to witness twice. This view aligned naturally with their perception of the gods. The gods operated on scales far larger than human lifespans. If a bright visitor returned only once per era, it remained consistent with divine timing. The clay did not question these ideas, it preserved them. The belief in recurrence also shaped the way scribes interpreted differences between sky events. If a comet returned with different brightness or a different orientation, that difference gained significance. The structure of the Omen tradition encouraged comparison. A scribe might examine two entries written centuries apart and conclude that they describe the same cosmic visitor. Even if the events differed physically, the system allowed them to be linked by association. The resulting interpretation blended observation and tradition in ways that shaped the understanding of cycles. In some periods, scribes attempted to organise the omen series into larger collections. These collections contained long lists of signs paired with consequences. A single tablet might reference dozens of potential sky events. The collections implied that the scribes believed they were cataloguing a complete set of possibilities. The belief in cycles strengthened the sense that each event belonged somewhere in this structure. The rarest events did not fall outside the pattern. They were simply placed in sections reserved for uncommon or long-interval signs. This method of organisation allowed for the inclusion of cosmic disturbances that had not occurred within recent memory. A scribe reading an old entry about a fiery object might believe it belonged to a cycle even if no one alive had seen such an object. The expectation of recurrence gave the system its longevity. People trusted it because it appeared to extend across centuries, reflected in the clay. Some of the most striking entries described disturbances so dramatic that later interpreters wondered whether they reflected real astronomical events. The entries mentioned large bodies crossing the sky, intense brightness, or unusual colouring. They sometimes describe a disturbance lasting days, which suggests a comet rather than a meteor. These descriptions gain new meaning when placed within the idea of cycles. If such an object appeared once, the clay implied it could return. The notion of recurrence strengthened the idea that the sky was not random. Scribes believed the universe followed an ordered sequence of signs. Even unpredictable visitors fit within that sequence. This outlook made it easy for later thinkers to imagine that ancient people had predicted events that lay far beyond their own time. If a cosmic visitor was recorded once and interpreted within a cycle, the absence of its return did not weaken the tradition. It reinforced the impression that the event had simply not arrived yet. The system of cycles also created a sense of layering across generations. Older entries gained authority because they had survived. Newer entries gained meaning because they were added to the existing structure. A scribe writing in a later era did not separate ancient observations from current ones. All entries belonged to the same body of knowledge. The clay formed a continuous conversation across centuries. This continuity made long-term patterns feel real, even if the physical evidence for those patterns was incomplete. Some tablets attempt to describe the timing of certain events, though without the precision of later Babylonian astronomy. They reference seasons, constellations, or the direction of movement. These details helped scribes determine whether an unusual visitor belonged to a known pattern, or represented something new. If the visitor resembled an earlier entry, the scribes assumed it belonged to the same cycle. This assumption strengthened the belief that the sky produced recurring signs. Even if two events were separated by centuries, the clay connected them. This connection contributed to the belief that the Sumerians saw patterns invisible to modern readers. The patterns were not mathematical, they were cultural. They reflected centuries of inherited interpretation. When a single line described a bright visitor causing disruption across the land, later scribes treated that line as a point in a repeating series. The absence of subsequent disruptions did not challenge the belief. It expanded the timeline. The system gained further complexity when scribes began pairing sky events with historical outcomes. A comet appearing during a period of political tension gained unique significance. A meteor burst during a famine might acquire a lasting association with scarcity. These associations formed new patterns that scribes believed extended across eras. If a comet appeared again, even under different circumstances, the earlier association influenced interpretation. The omen tradition encouraged this approach. It trained scribes to look for patterns across generations. A single observation became the basis for a long-term cycle, not because it repeated, but because the system assumed repetition. The clay preserved this assumption with remarkable stability, creating a world view that extended far beyond the reach of direct experience. These cycles also created the conditions for anticipation. When scribes believed a significant visitor followed a long interval, they watched the sky with heightened awareness. The anticipation did not create urgency, it created continuity. communities understood that their lives existed within larger patterns that stretched across centuries. The expectation of a returning visitor became part of the cultural background. Even if the visitor never appeared, the belief remained active because the clay preserved it. This dynamic shaped the idea of strange patterns within Sumerian observation. Modern readers sometimes conclude that the scribes detected real long-term astronomical cycles. While some cycles reflected reality, such as the visibility of certain comets, others emerged through cultural interpretation. The system combined both types seamlessly. A comet with a long orbital period might reappear across centuries, a meteor shower might recur annually, an eclipse might follow a recognizable rhythm. These real patterns supported the idea that all sky events followed similar rules. Within this environment, the idea of a missing or overdue visitor became plausible. If a tablet referenced a significant object that appeared in an earlier era, and if no similar event had occurred since, scribes believed the cycle remained incomplete. They assumed the visitor would eventually return. This assumption carried forward through later traditions. The absence of the visitor added weight to the expectation. The clay preserved a narrative that modern interpreters find compelling because it blends observation, tradition, and anticipation. The idea of strange patterns also influenced how scribes interpreted incomplete records. A tablet mentioning a bright visitor without describing a consequence left an open space within the pattern. Later scribes filled this space with expectations drawn from other entries. This method created the impression of coherent cycles even when the original records were fragmented. The omen tradition encouraged scribes to create continuity wherever possible. Continuity strengthened the system and gave the clay a sense of authority that extended beyond individual entries. This authority shaped how generations perceived the sky. People living in later eras saw the heavens not as a random field of lights, but as a structured environment filled with meaningful patterns. These patterns did not need to be verified through repeated observation. They existed because the clay preserved them. The clay formed a bridge between the sky and the world below. It allowed people to believe that they lived inside a cosmic system that revealed itself through signs. The belief in cycles led naturally to the idea of returns. Returns shaped the idea of prediction. Prediction shaped the idea of long-term anticipation. Through this progression, the omen tradition formed a worldview in which cosmic visitors were expected to appear again, even if their return fell far beyond the horizon of lived experience. As this narrative moves forward, the path leads toward the ways these expectations influenced how people prepared for large disturbances. The next stage explores how entire communities responded to the possibility of sky events that seemed capable of reshaping the world, and how those responses formed the early foundations for the belief that something enormous might still lie ahead. As the omen traditions expanded and the idea of long cycles grew more established, early civilizations across the Near East developed a shared awareness that the sky held more than predictable patterns. They understood the regular paths traced by the moon. They recognized the steady courses of the planets. They counted on the return of seasonal stars. Yet above all that familiarity stood a quieter belief that the sky could shift suddenly and alter the world below without warning. Stories, clay records, and inherited memories combined to create a landscape of expectation. People lived with the awareness that the next disturbance might arrive at any time. This awareness shaped how entire communities perceived their surroundings. The land around them changed often enough to keep them cautious. Rivers flooded without clear explanation. Seasons arrived earlier or later than expected. Storms built quickly. Winds altered the shape of fields. These irregularities influenced how people viewed the heavens, because the sky was the one environment that always appeared open and visible. When the land behaved unpredictably, people looked upward for clues. If the clues appeared as streaks, visitors, or shadows, the meaning attached to them carried more weight than any isolated land-based event. Civilizations that depended on agriculture felt this connection intensely. Crops could fail with little warning. Livestock suffered in seasons that shifted toward drought or cold. Communities learned to read the world closely because their survival depended on it. The sky became part of this reading. A cloudless night allowed watchers to observe faint lights or unusual glows. A bright object near the horizon drew immediate attention. A sudden flash caused concern because it disrupted the natural rhythm of the environment. These disruptions formed the basis of the earliest fears that the sky itself could pose a threat. The fears were not exaggerated or symbolic. They grew from repeated experience. People had witnessed fireballs descending. They had heard the sound of fragmenting meteors. They had seen the sudden darkening of the sun. They had watched the moon vanish into shadow. Each of these events created memories that lasted beyond the moment. When those memories entered the omen tradition, they gathered significance and gained new layers of interpretation. The fear did not come from misunderstanding. It came from understanding too much of the unstable world around them. Ancient communities lived close to the raw forces of nature. They lacked the buffers that later societies developed. When the ground shook, they had no framework for explaining it beyond the movement of unseen forces. When a comet appeared, they lacked the tools to place it within a stable system of orbits. They saw the sky as an active environment capable of reaching down into their world. The fear was simply recognition of vulnerability. This sense of vulnerability spread across different regions and cultures. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and parts of the Levant developed their own methods of interpreting the sky. Each region had local variations, but the core insight remained the same. The sky was powerful. The sky was unpredictable. The sky was capable of shaping the world. Even cultures that built monuments aligned with solar and lunar cycles held the quiet understanding that the heavens could alter their stability. The monuments helped track order, but they did not promise protection. Some civilizations preserved stories of earlier disturbances that seemed to hint at widespread impact. These stories described years of dim sunlight, extreme weather, or disrupted agriculture. Even if the stories lacked precise details, they reflected real hardship. Hardship followed sky events often enough that the association became unavoidable. A comet bright enough to be seen during the day created memories that lasted for generations. A meteor burst that produced a shock wave turned into stories about falling stars. These stories did not remain isolated. They circulated through trade routes, temple networks, and shared cultural spaces. In this environment, fear of impact became part of the cultural background. Impact did not need to be imagined as a world-ending collision. It could represent the arrival of something unexpected, something that altered the natural order. The omen tradition shaped this fear by giving it structure. The clay tablets described earlier disturbances with such clarity that later readers felt the weight of those events even if they had not experienced anything similar. The descriptions themselves created a sense of history tied to the sky. The readers believed they had inherited a record of what the heavens were capable of doing. The belief that cosmic visitors could influence the world gave shape to the fear of future disturbances. People expected the sky to provide signals before major changes occurred. They believed the gods worked through those signals. This belief did not encourage passivity. It encouraged preparation. Rituals developed to address potential dangers. Communities performed offerings to reduce the impact of celestial disturbances. Kings consulted priests to determine whether a sky event required immediate action. These responses reflected a deeper recognition of the sky as an environment that needed to be watched carefully. Over time, the fear of sky disturbances evolved into a belief that the world existed under a form of cosmic order. The order included cycles, returns, and disruptions that came at irregular intervals. The clay preserved these ideas with remarkable stability. Once written, the ideas gained authority. The omen tradition shaped how people interpreted both new events and old memories. A comet that appeared during a period of political transition gained significance that extended beyond its physical presence. A shadow over the moon became a reference point for future interpretations. The fear associated with these events did not arise from panic. It grew from collective experience. Ancient civilizations often faced challenges that tested their survival. Cities fell, crops failed, climates shifted, populations moved. The people who lived through these changes developed an acute awareness of how quickly the world could alter. When the sky produced rare and dramatic events, these moments became symbols of change. The symbols entered the clay turned them into patterns. The patterns created expectations. Once expectations existed, the fear that something larger might eventually arrive took root. The idea of a large visitor capable of altering the world did not require a specific prediction. It grew naturally from the accumulated significance attached to earlier visitors. If a comet caused concern once, a future comet could cause greater concern. If a bright object seemed to signal disruption, a future bright object might signal something more intense. The omen tradition magnified these ideas by placing them within structured lists. These lists did not attempt to measure the physical properties of cosmic visitors. They focused on the meaning attached to them. The meaning held more importance than the physical event. If a disturbance appeared during a year of hardship, the clay recorded the disturbance and the hardship in proximity. Even if the two events were unrelated, the association became part of the cultural memory. Later readers assumed the association reflected a deeper truth. This process strengthened the belief that the sky itself was capable of shaping the world. People learned to anticipate changes based on the heavens. Even when the sky remained calm for long periods, the memory of earlier disturbances persisted. Generations passed without major events, yet the clay preserved the possibility. The possibility shaped attitudes toward the sky. The sky became a source of both order and uncertainty. Order came from predictable cycles. Uncertainty came from rare disturbances. In this landscape, a sense of waiting developed. The waiting did not imply impatience, it reflected awareness. People lived with the knowledge that the sky could shift at any time. They did not know when the next disturbance would arrive. They only knew that earlier generations had recorded such events. The clay made these events part of their world. Even if no one alive had witnessed a major disturbance, the tradition allowed them to imagine what might occur. This imagination did not create exaggerated images of disaster. It created a quiet sense of potential. The potential shaped how people interpreted smaller disturbances. A faint glow could be the beginning of something larger. A bright streak could represent a preview of a future event. A lingering tail across the night sky could be the first sign of a returning visitor documented centuries earlier. The omen tradition encouraged such interpretations. It provided the framework for connecting the present with the distant past. The fear associated with this framework was practical. It did not prevent communities from functioning. People continued farming, trading, building, and raising families. They simply carried the awareness that the sky was not passive. This awareness influenced how they approached changes in leadership, environmental conditions, and social behavior. If the sky displayed signs of disruption, people responded with caution. The caution came from a belief that the gods operated through these events. The gods were not remote, they were involved in the world. The belief in divine involvement gave the fear structure and purpose. Without structure, fear becomes unmanageable. With structure, fear becomes a guide. The omen tradition functioned as a guide. It offered explanations for disturbances that might otherwise cause confusion or despair. When a comet appeared, communities turned to the tablets. When the moon dimmed, priests consulted earlier records. This consultation created a sense of continuity. The people believed they were part of a world that had faced similar events before. The idea of impact emerged from this continuity. People recognized that falling objects could reach the ground. Stones from the sky existed in temple collections. These stones reinforced the belief that the heavens could send physical visitors. A world that had already experienced falling objects could imagine larger ones. This imagination built gradually, influenced by generations of careful observation. The clay preserved references to objects that caused fear in earlier eras. Later readers believed those objects carried consequences large enough to affect entire regions. This belief shaped the possibility that a future visitor might cause even greater disruption. The omen tradition did not need to predict such an event explicitly. It simply preserved the idea that cosmic disturbances held significant meaning. Over time, the meaning expanded. The expanded meaning created the impression that some events described in the tablets had not yet occurred. If the tablets referenced a large visitor with major consequences, and if no similar visitor had appeared in recent memory, readers assumed the event remained in the future. A world shaped by these ideas learned to wait. The waiting formed part of the cultural background. It appeared in rituals, administrative decisions, and the careful training of scribes. The scribes inherited the responsibility of reading the sky with precision and caution. They learned that the sky could contain patterns visible only across long intervals. They studied earlier entries not only to understand the past, but to prepare for potential future events. This narrative continues by following how these expectations influenced the growth of early astronomical knowledge. The next stage explores how the scribes and skywatchers refined their methods, transforming inherited fear into detailed observation that bridged the world of omens with the world of early science. Long before their ideas filtered into later traditions, long before their tablets reached the hands of historians, the Sumerians developed one of the earliest sustained attempts to understand the structure of the sky. Their approach did not resemble modern astronomy, yet it held a level of precision that surprises anyone seeing it for the first time. They did not calculate planetary orbits or develop optical instruments. They did not isolate celestial bodies through mathematical models. Instead, they created a system rooted in long observation, careful recording, and the belief that the heavens behaved with purpose. Their understanding of space formed through steady practice, shaped by centuries of watching the sky over the flat horizon of southern Mesopotamia. The people who lived in those first cities along the rivers had countless opportunities to examine the heavens. Night stretched long across open plains, unobstructed by mountains or tall forests. The sky gave them a clear view of rising stars, planetary movements, and distant glows. These early observers knew the sky by memory long before they knew it by writing. When writing arrived, it became a tool to preserve that memory with precision. Even the earliest tablets that reference celestial events carry a sense of continuity. They show that the people who wrote them had inherited methods of observation that extended far behind their own time. This inheritance shaped what the Sumerians knew about space. Their knowledge did not develop through isolated discoveries. It grew through repetition, observation, and the confidence that the sky's predictable structure helped reveal its unpredictable elements. They knew the moon followed a recognizable cycle. They tracked it closely for practical reasons as well as symbolic ones. The length of months depended on its phases. Agricultural decisions often relied on its timing. They used the moon to coordinate social and religious activities. Over time, they noticed small variations in its path, subtle shifts that helped them create more detailed calendars. They also understood the difference between planets and stars. They did not use the word planet in the modern sense, but they recognized certain lights wandered across the sky while others stayed fixed in their patterns. These wandering lights formed the basis of early interpretations about movement within the heavens. The Sumerians assigned them roles, treating them as significant entities capable of influencing events on Earth. This blending of observation and meaning reflected the way they approached all celestial bodies. Nothing in the sky existed without purpose. Even the stars that moved in fixed arrangements played roles in timing seasons and measuring the world. Their observations extended beyond the regular motions. They paid close attention to the points where the sun rose and set throughout the year. These points shifted along the horizon, marking the passage of seasons. Early temples took these movements into account. Architecture aligned with these points to track cycles for religious and practical reasons. A building might catch the first rays of the solstice sunrise, or mark the position of a particular star that returned each year. These alignments reflected deliberate effort rather than accidental design. They show that the Sumerians used architecture as a tool for studying the sky. Over generations, the scribes refined these observations into detailed records. They developed lists of fixed stars associated with certain months. They noted when certain constellations appeared at dawn or vanished into the sun's glare. These observations helped them predict seasonal transitions. Although they did not develop mathematics capable of modelling celestial motions, they created a working system that allowed them to estimate long-term cycles. The system blended practicality with symbolism, because the Sumerians did not separate those concepts. They did not treat the sky as a purely physical environment. They treated it as a meaningful environment whose predictable behaviour contributed to stability. Their interpretation of comets and other irregular visitors grew from this foundation. Because the regular bodies in the sky moved in predictable ways, anything outside those patterns stood out sharply. A comet with a bright tail moving against the background of stars created an immediate sense of difference. The Sumerians documented these differences with care. They recorded the position, direction, and duration of unusual lights. They compared them to earlier entries. These comparisons helped them form expectations about how such visitors behaved. They did not understand orbits, but they recognized repetition when it occurred. If a comet returned with similar appearance to an earlier one, the scribes connected the events. Even if they misinterpreted the details, their observations demonstrate close attention to the sky. Some of the earliest astronomical texts likely began as lists of stars and planets, written for training scribes. These lists show that the Sumerians organized the heavens systematically. They recognized constellations and used them as anchors for observation. They track the movement of Venus with remarkable consistency, even though they did not calculate its orbit. Venus held special significance among the planets because of its brightness and visibility during dawn and dusk. Its changing position became a reliable indicator for certain rituals and calendar adjustments. Sumerian scribes recorded these changes in ways that later Babylonian astronomers refined with increasing sophistication. The Sumerians also observed the periodic disappearance of planets behind the sun and their later reappearance. They did not understand why the planets vanished, but they treated these absences as meaningful. The reappearance of a bright planet after a period of invisibility represented renewal or transition. These interpretations helped shape the omen tradition, because any unusual delay in reappearance or unexpected brightness became a sign worth recording. This blending of astronomy and meaning allowed the Sumerians to track long-term cycles with a depth that seemed surprising for a civilization without advanced instruments. What they knew about space extended beyond the objects they could name clearly. They recognized that the sky contained regions of differing behavior. Some parts of the sky held constellations that served as seasonal indicators. Other regions contained wandering bodies. Still others served as the backdrop for rare events. The Sumerians developed a sense of the sky as a layered environment. Each layer carried its own meaning, whether practical, symbolic, or interpretive. This layered understanding shaped how they approached astronomy. They observed that some stars never set, remaining visible throughout the year. These stars held special significance because they represented permanence. The Sumerians used them as reference points when aligning structures or tracking the motion of planets. The perspective they gained from these stars helped shape their belief that the sky possessed fixed and moving components. The fixed components provided stability. The moving components provided information. This division served as one of the earliest conceptual frameworks for understanding space. Their interest extended to atmospheric phenomena as well. They documented unusual halos around the sun or moon, noting how these appearances related to weather patterns. They recorded observations of light displays near the horizon at dawn or dusk. They even attempted to describe the brightness of stars under different conditions. These efforts show that the Sumerians approached the sky with a level of persistence that allowed them to gather useful knowledge even without understanding the physical causes behind the phenomena. The blending of astronomy with myth did not reduce the accuracy of their observations. Instead, it provided a structure for organizing them. The gods gave meaning to what they saw. Meaning encouraged careful documentation. The clay tablets reflect this commitment. A list of stars might sit beside a record of an eclipse. A description of a bright visitor might appear beside administrative entries unrelated to astronomy. The placement reflected the reality of daily life. Observations of the sky were not isolated activities. They were woven into the fabric of how the society operated. The Sumerians recognized eclipses as significant long before they understood their cycles. They knew that the moon's darkening followed patterns, even if the patterns were not fully predictable. They documented the length and shape of the shadow. They noted the changes in the moon's colour. Later generations within Mesopotamia refined these observations enough to predict eclipses with limited accuracy. The early foundations laid by the Sumerians made this possible. Their descriptive approach created a tradition that encouraged precision. Their understanding of space also involved an appreciation for the distance between celestial bodies. They recognized that the stars remained fixed relative to one another. This observation led them to conclude that stars were not close to the planets or the moon. Although they did not calculate distances, they understood separation. Separation formed part of their worldview. The heavens contained multiple layers, and each layer operated under its own principles. This belief shaped how they interpreted cosmic visitors. A bright comet or meteor appeared to cross between layers, creating the impression that it had entered the world from a separate region of the sky. The Sumerians drew connections between the appearance of unusual visitors and the cycles of the regular bodies. If a comet appeared near the time of planetary conjunctions or eclipses, they recorded the coincidence carefully. They believed such alignments increased the significance of the event. This belief encouraged deeper tracking of cosmic disturbances, because any unusual coincidence suggested a more complex pattern. These patterns formed the basis for long-term expectations. When the clay tablets referenced earlier events of similar nature, the scribes connected them across time. Although their approach lacked modern scientific methods, it produced data that later scholars could build upon. The movements they recorded helped future civilizations improve their understanding of planetary cycles. The lists they created helped identify long-term patterns. Their interest in the relationship between sky events and earthly conditions encouraged regular observation. Even when their interpretations leaned heavily towards symbolic meaning, the underlying observations remained grounded in reality. What the Sumerians knew about space can be summarized through their dedication to watching the heavens. They understood the regular cycles of the moon and sun. They recognized the wandering planets. They tracked bright visitors and recorded their movements. They identified fixed stars and used them to mark seasons. They observed eclipses and documented their characteristics. They connected sky events with events on Earth, forming a system that linked the two environments seamlessly. Their knowledge did not need to separate myth from observation. The two existed together without conflict. Myth gave shape to meaning. Observation gave shape to knowledge. The combination created a system flexible enough to incorporate new discoveries and durable enough to survive centuries of copying. The clay preserved their insights even as their world changed. Through those tablets, the Sumerians passed their understanding of space to cultures that followed them. Their knowledge did not remain isolated. It influenced Babylonian astronomy, contributed to long-term skywatching traditions, and shaped the interpretive frameworks of later civilizations. As this narrative continues, the next stage follows how this early knowledge created a foundation for interpreting evidence hidden beneath the surface. Observers learned to read not only the sky but the land itself for signs of cosmic disturbances. The connection between the heavens and the earth deepened as people sought meaning beyond observation alone, shaping the next phase of the story. As the tradition of skywatching grew across the early cities of Mesopotamia, the records left behind did more than catalogue unusual lights or shifting shadows. They preserved memories of events that shaped how ancient people understood the world. These records carried observations across generations, leaving later scribes to interpret entries they themselves had never witnessed. When those scribes encountered descriptions of bright visitors or disturbances that seemed extraordinary even by the standards of their own time, they treated the entries with a seriousness shaped by centuries of accumulated meaning. The clay did not distinguish between myth, memory, and observation. It preserved all of it with equal certainty, creating a long chain of references that later observers inherited without knowing how to separate the original experiences from the interpretations placed upon them. This blending created a world in which real events could hide beneath layers of symbolism. A meteor burst could become a divine message. A comet with an unusually close approach could become an omen of great change. A flash in the night could become a sign from the heavens. The Sumerians did not intend to obscure physical events. They simply described them through a world view in which natural and meaningful actions were inseparable. Their method allowed physical events to become part of cultural memory in ways that preserved the observation while transforming the interpretation. Because of this, modern readers often wonder whether some written records reflect real astronomical events that have not yet been traced conclusively. The possibility is not unreasonable. The ancient world witnessed many sky events that remain difficult to identify today. Meteor bursts, bright comets, and atmospheric disturbances occurred with enough force to leave impressions that lasted for generations. The records left behind contain descriptions that sometimes align with what modern science recognizes as real phenomena. In these cases, ancient scribes documented events with surprising accuracy, even without understanding the physical causes. Consider the way early scribes described brightness. They used consistent language to express intensity, colour, and duration. A bright object described as lingering across the sky for several days likely represented a comet rather than a meteor. A short flash with mention of sound or fragmentation likely indicated a bolide. If the record mentioned directional components or unusual movements, later readers could infer a trajectory. These descriptions are grounded enough that researchers can attempt to match them with known astronomical behaviour, even if the original event cannot be identified precisely. Some tablets describe disturbances that appear larger or more dramatic than common comets or meteors. One type of entry mentions an object bright enough to obscure stars or cast light on the ground. Another describes a disturbance lasting several days with changes in brightness. These descriptions suggest a large comet passing unusually close to the Earth or entering a region of the sky that made it appear more intense. Even without knowing the nature of the object, the scribes documented its behaviour clearly enough to capture the interest of later readers. The possibility that the Sumerians witnessed a particularly bright or unusual comet has influenced many modern interpretations. They did not record dates in the modern sense, which complicates attempts to align their records with known astronomical cycles. Their calendar system shifted often, and the copies of tablets came from different eras. These challenges make it difficult to identify whether their observations correspond to specific comets with long orbital periods. Still, some descriptions resemble known types of periodic comets, particularly those with extended visibility and noticeable changes in tail structure. The idea that ancient records might hide a real event becomes more compelling when examining the consistency across different tablets. When multiple entries from different cities describe similar disturbances, it suggests that the event was widespread enough to capture the attention of diverse observers. The consistency does not necessarily imply collaboration or influence. It reflects how significant sky events surpass cultural boundaries. A comet bright enough to be seen across a wide region would naturally appear in multiple records. A meteor burst large enough to create a shock wave would be remembered long after the event. These memories preserved in clay became part of a growing record of cosmic disturbances. Later scribes reading these entries treated them as part of the lineage of sky-watching knowledge. Even if they could not verify the original experience, they carried the responsibility of preserving it. This preservation allowed real events to pass through generations without losing their essential shape, even as the meanings attached to them changed. Some entries appear to describe sequences rather than isolated events. A tablet might reference multiple disturbances occurring within a short period. These disturbances could represent meteor showers, clusters of fireballs, or atmospheric changes associated with nearby cometary debris. The ancient scribes did not interpret them through physical understanding. They interpreted them through context. If several unusual lights appeared in the sky within a year, the clay linked them into a pattern. The pattern then influenced how future disturbances were interpreted. Patterns formed this way are not inherently inaccurate. They often reflect real cycles, such as the annual passage of meteor streams or the periodic return of comets. The Sumerians did not know the mechanics behind these cycles, but they recognized repetition in what they observed. This recognition allowed them to store long-term information in ways that closely parallel early scientific thinking. Their records also include descriptions of shadows that altered the appearance of the sky. Eclipses played a significant role in these entries. The Sumerians documented solar and lunar shadows with notable clarity. They described the shape, colour, duration, and orientation of the eclipsed body. These details reveal that their observations were not merely symbolic. They were driven by an interest in understanding what the sky was doing. Over time, these eclipse records became detailed enough for later cultures to refine into predictive models. Although the Sumerians themselves did not anticipate eclipses mathematically, their careful documentation contributed to the long-term development of astronomy. Some eclipse descriptions may also be connected to atmospheric disturbances or volcanic events. Anomalous darkness or reddish light could reflect environmental changes. These changes would have been visible across wide regions. The clay records capture these anomalies in terms that resemble descriptions found in other early cultures. When multiple civilizations record similar disturbances, it suggests that the events were real and significant enough to shape cultural memory. The idea that ancient records might contain evidence of real cosmic events aligns with the fact that the Earth has experienced major impacts and atmospheric disturbances throughout its history. Although the most dramatic impact occurred before human civilizations emerged, smaller but still significant events continued into historical periods. A large bolide with an airburst could devastate a region without leaving an obvious crater. A meteorite with sufficient mass could reach the ground and be collected as a trophy or sacred object. These possibilities offer reasonable explanations for some of the dramatic descriptions found in the tablets. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Sumerian records is the presence of entries that suggest a major event was expected to return. Whether the scribes believed the event followed a cycle or simply preserved its memory as a potential future occurrence, the entries imply an awareness of long-term behaviour in the heavens. This awareness may reflect the influence of widespread comet traditions. Many comets with long orbital periods return so infrequently that multiple generations pass without seeing them. If a particularly bright comet appeared once in Sumerian memory, its return could be assumed even if no one alive had witnessed it twice. This idea becomes more compelling when considering how the omen tradition handled rare events. The structure of the tablets allowed for entries that referenced events far outside the normal range. These entries carried more weight precisely because they were unusual. When a scribe read about a dramatic visitor that had appeared in an earlier era, the possibility of its return became a matter of cultural expectation. Even if the event did not occur within the lifetime of that scribe, the expectation remained active in the clay. The blending of astronomical observation with cultural meaning created a system in which real events could remain visible beneath layers of later interpretation. This blending makes it difficult to determine which entries reflect physical occurrences and which reflect symbolic constructs. Modern approaches to these tablets must balance these two possibilities. Some events described may indeed correspond to real astronomical phenomena. Others may represent the cultural framework through which the Sumerians understood the universe. The clay carries both types of information without distinguishing them. The challenge lies in determining where one ends and the other begins. The tablets do not offer direct explanations. They present observations and consequences in the same compact format. This format makes it necessary to interpret entries through context. A reference to an unusual light in the spring may align with known meteor showers. A description of an object with a tail may refer to a comet. A record of sudden darkness may represent an eclipse. At the same time, entries describing unusual or irregular movements that do not match known patterns may represent real events that are not easily identifiable today. The absence of precise dates complicates analysis. Even if an event was real, placing it within an exact timeline is difficult. The Sumerians did not track years in a continuous sequence. They counted years by the reign of kings or the occurrence of major events. This method creates gaps in the record. It also means that the timing of celestial disturbances often depends on context rather than chronology. Without a consistent timeline, correlating events with known astronomical cycles becomes challenging. Despite these challenges, the possibility remains that some Sumerian entries describe events modern science has not yet matched. Large comets with long orbital periods may have passed near Earth in the distant past, but have not returned in recorded history. Meteor bursts with significant energy may have occurred in regions where physical traces eroded or were never discovered. Atmospheric phenomena influenced by volcanic eruptions or climatic shifts may have shaped sky appearances in ways no longer visible today. Any of these events could leave records that survive in clay but remain unrecognized in modern research. The clay preserved enough detail to make the possibility credible. The scribes wrote with a level of consistency that suggests genuine effort to capture observable phenomena. Even when their interpretations lean toward symbolic meaning, the underlying descriptions often reflect real structures and behaviors in the sky. Their accuracy does not require modern understanding. It requires attentive observation and careful recording, both of which the Sumerians practiced as part of their cultural tradition. As the records continued to accumulate, the possibility of a major event hidden within the clay became part of the wider tradition. Later scribes reading the tablets saw references to objects bright enough to disturb entire communities. They encountered descriptions of disturbances that seemed to exceed typical comets or meteors. These entries shaped the idea that the sky had once produced something extraordinary. If no similar event had occurred in living memory, the idea that it remained part of the future grew naturally. This belief did not remain isolated in the tablets. It influenced how communities responded to unusual visitors. Even small disturbances could activate memories of earlier entries. The presence of a bright tail across the night sky might serve as a reminder of a larger event known only through clay. This connection magnified the significance of each new disturbance. The sky became a place where echoes of the past could signal possibilities for the future. As this narrative continues, the next stage follows how scholars, rulers, and sky watchers approach the tension between belief and uncertainty. The story moves toward the growing awareness that some events remained incomplete, preserved only in memory and clay, waiting for interpretations that could bridge the gap between ancient expectations and the long horizon that stretched ahead. The tablets that survive from early Mesopotamia hold more than records of shifting lights and ancient warnings. They preserve a quiet disagreement that stretched across centuries, even if no one described it directly. On one side stood the long tradition of omen interpretation, in which every unusual sky event carried meaning and every dramatic disturbance pointed towards something larger. On the other stood a growing strand of practical observation, in which the sky revealed patterns that could be described without assuming deeper intent. These two perspectives did not compete openly, they coexisted. They shaped how scribes interpreted the world, even as generations learned to navigate the space between belief and measured understanding. When modern readers examine these tablets, they often note how seamlessly the Sumerians blended careful observation with meaning. Yet beneath that blend lies a puzzle. Some entries describe disturbances so intense that later readers assume a real astronomical event must have inspired them. These entries tell of objects bright enough to illuminate the landscape, shadows that moved across the sky in unusual ways, or visitors that lingered for days with unpredictable shifts in brightness. The clay captures these moments without embellishment. The scribes who wrote them used the same concise style they applied to administrative records. This simplicity raises the possibility that the events were not symbolic at their core. They were witnessed. If these events were real, they should fit within the framework of known astronomical behaviour. Comets, meteor bursts, and rare alignments can all produce dramatic effects. However, some descriptions do not align neatly with common phenomena. They suggest disturbances larger than typical comets, or brighter than most atmospheric events. The clay never claims these events caused physical destruction on the ground, yet the detail used to describe them implies a level of significance that influenced how later scribes viewed the sky. The challenge lies in determining whether these entries represent actual astronomical events or symbolic constructs that grew through repeated copying. The earlier tablets lacked clear dating. The scribes often reference kings' reigns or major cultural events rather than consistent chronological sequences. This lack of continuous dating complicates attempts to align the events with known comets or meteor storms. Without precise dates, modern attempts to match events with astronomical cycles become difficult. Skeptics argue that the absence of direct physical evidence suggests that these entries describe symbolic narratives rather than real phenomena. They point out that the omen tradition encouraged scribes to emphasize meaning rather than mechanism. The entries were not intended as scientific logs. They were meant to guide interpretation. If a tablet described a bright visitor causing concern, skeptics argue that the description reflects cultural anxiety rather than literal observation. This perspective sees the clay as a repository of belief rather than evidence. However, this view does not fully address the consistency across the tablets. Multiple cities recorded similar disturbances with similar phrasing. These similarities imply shared experience rather than shared invention. The scribes who compiled the Omen series worked with material inherited from earlier periods. They did not create the entries from imagination. They copied and reorganized them. If a dramatic event appeared in multiple records, the simplest explanation is that the event was witnessed by many people across a wide region. Scientists who approach these tablets from a more observational perspective highlight this consistency as evidence that some entries describe real phenomena. They note that ancient cultures around the world recorded bright visitors, unusual meteor storms, and comet appearances with similar language. These similarities support the idea that early civilizations witnessed events that modern researchers have not yet identified or dated. The Sumerians may have recorded a comet with an unusually long orbital period. They may have witnessed a meteor burst with energy high enough to produce lasting memory, but not high enough to leave obvious geological traces. Such events could easily slip through the gaps in modern scientific understanding. The puzzle becomes more intriguing when considering the tradition of returns and cycles. The clay contains entries that imply certain disturbances follow long intervals. The scribes described visitors that arrived unexpectedly, lingered, and then vanished from memory for generations. They did not understand orbital mechanics, but they recognized patterns. This recognition created expectations of recurrence. If an earlier generation recorded a bright visitor with significant meaning, later generations assumed it would return. When the visitor did not appear again, the expectation remained open. This expectation contributes to the puzzle of an impact or disturbance that the tablets describe, but that modern readers have no record of in physical evidence. The tablets do not claim that the event occurred within the lifetime of the scribes themselves. They refer to earlier periods, sometimes ancient even by Sumerian standards. These references create the impression that the scribes preserved a memory of a disturbance that had not yet returned. The possibility that the Sumerians transmitted a record of a real event that has not reappeared remains open. This is where skeptics and scientists meet in an unexpected overlap. Both groups acknowledge that ancient people witnessed dramatic sky events. Both acknowledge that real events can become exaggerated or reinterpreted through cultural lenses. The difference lies in the assumption about scale. Skeptics tend to assume the events were relatively small. Perhaps a bright comet or meteor burst became significant through cultural interpretation rather than physical impact. Scientists who consider long-period comets acknowledge that some visitors may not return for thousands of years or longer. A bright event described in ancient tablets could represent a comet still on its distant journey, or one that will not return within any predictable human timescale. The possibility that the tablets hide evidence of a real event that has not yet repeated does not require extraordinary assumptions. The Earth encounters large cosmic objects regularly across geological timescales. Only a few of these events occur within the span of human civilizations, and many leave no lasting traces visible to modern detection. A bright comet passing unusually close may not leave geological evidence. A meteor burst that explodes in the atmosphere can release significant energy without creating an impact crater. Such events could be dramatic enough to enter cultural memory while leaving no physical trace. Another factor complicates the interpretation of these records. The Sumerians preserved their knowledge through copying rather than continuous observation. A tablet written in one period might be copied in another with slight modifications. The scribes believed in preserving inherited knowledge even when its original context was no longer clear. This practice preserved ancient events, but also allowed symbolic interpretations to merge with literal descriptions. Over centuries, an earlier entry describing a bright object could merge with later beliefs about cosmic cycles or divine action. This merging does not invalidate the original observation, it simply reshapes how it appears in the later record. Modern researchers attempting to disentangle these layers face significant challenges. The clay tablets do not provide standardized descriptions. The scribes use terminology shaped by cultural frameworks rather than scientific classification. Words describing brightness, movement, or shape reflect the worldview of the time. A modern scientist reading these descriptions must interpret them cautiously, understanding that the same word might refer to different types of events across different tablets. This ambiguity makes it difficult to determine whether specific entries describe comets, meteors, atmospheric disturbances, or symbolic interpretations. Despite these challenges, some entries stand out as plausible descriptions of real cosmic events. A tablet that described a bright body appearing near the horizon in multiple cities likely reflects a comet with wide visibility. An entry that mentions a sudden flash accompanied by sound may refer to a meteor burst. A record of a lingering glow across several nights may represent cometary dust interacting with the atmosphere. These entries do not require speculative interpretation. They align with known phenomena. The question becomes whether one or more of these entries describes an event that has not reoccurred. The consistency in describing rare disturbances suggests the possibility. If a comet with a highly eccentric orbit passed near the Earth once in ancient history, it could produce the dramatic effect described in the tablets. Such a comet might take thousands or tens of thousands of years to complete one orbit. If the orbit shifted due to interactions with other bodies or gravitational disturbances, the comet might never return to Earth's vicinity. In this case, the tablets could preserve the only human record of its appearance. The idea that ancient records contain evidence of a real but unrepeatable event does not diminish the significance of the omen tradition. The tradition allowed these records to survive. Even if the scribes interpreted the event symbolically, Their desire to preserve meaning ensured that observations passed to later generations. Without this system, many observations would have vanished. The clay became the medium through which ancient skywatchers communicated across centuries. Their records preserve the possibility of events that might otherwise be forgotten entirely. The puzzle grows when considering how later cultures inherited these records. Babylonian astronomers refined the mathematical understanding of celestial cycles. They built predictive systems based on planetary motions. Yet even they preserved the earlier omen traditions. They copied the entries describing unusual visitors. They maintained the expectation of returns. This continuity demonstrates how strongly ancient cultures valued inherited knowledge. When a record described an event that had not yet repeated, later scholars did not dismiss it. They treated it as part of the larger pattern. Modern skepticism stems partly from the fact that the tablets survive in fragmented form. Many were damaged or lost. The entries that remain represent only a portion of the full tradition. It is likely that many descriptions of cosmic events existed in tablets that no longer survive. The fragments we possess create gaps in continuity. These gaps make it difficult to determine how many unusual events were recorded or how they were interpreted across time. The puzzle could be simpler with more complete records. Without them, the surviving entries carry disproportionate weight. A complete record might reveal that the dramatic events described were part of a larger sequence. If this were the case, the puzzle of the missing impact would shrink. The events could be placed within known cycles. However, the absence of a complete record leaves room for the idea that the Sumerians preserved a memory of a major disturbance that modern science has not yet identified. Until more tablets are discovered, the possibility remains open. The intersection of science and ancient tradition creates a unique tension in interpreting these entries. Science seeks physical explanations rooted in observable patterns. Ancient tradition sought meaning through continuity and symbolism. When the two perspectives meet, they reveal how much early civilizations understood and how much they transformed their observations through cultural frameworks. The puzzle of the missing event lies between these perspectives. It represents the gap between what was recorded and what can be verified. As this narrative continues, the next stage follows how these interpretations influence broader debates across the ancient world. The story turns toward the people who studied the sky with precision, those who doubted the omen tradition, and those who believed that the most dramatic events described in the clay represented a cycle still unfolding, waiting for a moment far beyond their own lifetimes. As centuries passed and the tablets of ancient Mesopotamia were buried beneath layers of soil, collapsed buildings and drifting sand, their meaning faded from memory. When they resurfaced in modern times, they brought with them a distant voice from a civilization that had watched the sky with an intensity few later cultures matched. The details in those tablets, especially the lines describing sudden bright visitors, long-tailed disturbances, and flashes that appeared without warning, captured the attention of modern astronomers who recognized traces of real astronomical behavior hidden beneath the stylized lines. The early excavators who uncovered these tablets were interested primarily in language, lore, and mythology. Only later did scholars notice that some entries referenced events that resembled astronomical phenomena. As more tablets appeared, a pattern emerged. These ancient people had not merely stared upward in fear. They had recorded their observations with enough precision that modern researchers could recognize descriptions of comets, meteor storms, eclipses, unusual atmospheric disturbances, and bright fireballs. The clay revealed a long tradition of skywatching that extended far beyond ritual or symbolism. When astronomers first read these entries, they approached them cautiously. The texts blended interpretation and observation so thoroughly that separating them required patience. Words describing brightness and movement reflected an ancient vocabulary, not scientific classification. Even so, many entries resembled known phenomena closely enough that modern experts could identify their likely causes. As more tablets were translated, the idea emerged that the ancient scribes had documented the sky with remarkable dedication. Yet one feature in the tablets raised more questions than answers. Some entries described disturbances so large or so unusual that they did not fit neatly within common categories. These descriptions did not appear often. They appeared rarely, scattered across tablets in different cities and different centuries. When compared side by side, they created an impression of an event either so intense or so unusual that it stood apart from the rest of the record. The lines described an object bright enough to cast shadows at night. They mentioned a disturbance that lingered across multiple evenings. Some hinted at a shift in the quality of light that observers could not explain. These details suggested something beyond a typical comet or meteor. If the entries referred to a real event, it may have been something uncommon enough to fall outside familiar patterns. Modern astronomers approached this possibility with measured interest. They knew that the Earth had encountered many unusual cosmic objects throughout its history: comets with eccentric orbits, long-period visitors that returned only after thousands of years, and large bolides capable of producing intense atmospheric effects were all within the realm of possibility. The tablets may have preserved one such event. If so, determining what it was became a challenge that required blending ancient information with modern techniques. The first attempts to analyse the more dramatic entries relied on comparisons with known comets. Researchers searched for references to objects with long visibility, changes in brightness, and unusual movement. These traits can help identify specific types of cometary behaviour. The difficulty lay in the dating. The tablets rarely included clear chronological markers. When they did, the markers referenced local events or kings rather than a continuous calendar. This lack of consistency made it difficult to connect the entries with known comets. Despite these obstacles, astronomers recognise that some cometary visitors have orbital periods extending thousands or even tens of thousands of years. A bright comet described in ancient tablets could easily correspond to a body still travelling through the outer regions of the solar system. If such a comet existed, it might not return within any predictable human timescale. This possibility contributed to the idea of a missing catastrophe, a disturbance described in clay that had not reappeared in modern memory. Some astronomers considered whether the tablets described a meteor burst of unusual magnitude. A meteor burst can produce intense light, sound, and temporary atmospheric changes without leaving a crater. Events similar to this have occurred within recent centuries. A meteor burst in Siberia, for example, flattened a vast region of land without striking the ground. If a similar event occurred in ancient Mesopotamia, it might not leave geological evidence easily detectable today. The clay descriptions of bright flashes and sudden disturbances could fit this type of event. Yet the entries describing long-lasting visibility posed challenges to this theory. A meteor burst lasts only moments. The tablets mentioned disturbances across multiple nights. These entries resembled comet behaviour more closely than meteor activity. A comet with an unusually bright coma and tail could produce extended visibility. If the comet passed extremely close to Earth, it might appear brighter than typical comets. Such close passes are rare, but not impossible. Cometary paths can shift over long periods, especially under the influence of gravitational interactions with planets or the Sun. These possibilities created a tension between those who saw a real event beneath the ancient descriptions and those who believed the entries represented symbolic or exaggerated accounts. Modern astronomers studied the tablets with increased attention, seeking details that could narrow the possibilities. They examined references to direction, brightness, colour, and movement. They considered whether the entries described a single event or multiple events combined through later interpretation. They also explored whether the tablets reflected cultural memory rather than direct observation. Some researchers pointed out that ancient cultures often preserved collective memories of real events long after the details became distorted. A comet with an unusually close approach could have produced effects dramatic enough to remain in cultural memory for centuries. Later scribes, far removed from the event, may have copied descriptions without knowing their origin. If the event never repeated, it could appear in the tablets as a unique disturbance, preserved through tradition rather than direct experience. This idea aligns with a broader pattern found in early civilizations. Many cultures preserve stories of bright visitors or falling stars that cause significant changes. These stories often appear in mythic form, yet the underlying events sometimes have physical explanations. A large meteor burst or cometry approach could inspire narratives passed down over generations. The Sumerians preserved such narratives in clay rather than oral tradition. The clay gives modern researchers an opportunity to examine these preserved memories more closely. The more astronomers studied the tablets, the more they recognized that the ancient scribes had recorded events with enough detail to support scientific inquiry. The descriptions of brightness aligned with known visual effects of comets. The references to duration matched known behavior of long-period visitors. Even the mentions of changes in light quality resembled known atmospheric effects associated with cometary dust. These similarities encourage researchers to consider that at least one dramatic event described in the tablets likely represented a real astronomical occurrence. However, the absence of physical evidence remains a point of caution. Without geological traces, confirming the event becomes difficult. Comets rarely leave identifiable evidence unless they fragment or strike the ground. If the object merely passed close to Earth, it may have left nothing behind except the observations preserved in clay. This creates a challenge for modern researchers who rely on physical records to verify ancient accounts. The idea of a missing catastrophe does not require a dramatic collision. It refers instead to the possibility that a large or unusual visitor passed near Earth in ancient times, producing visual effects significant enough to enter cultural memory. The term catastrophe in this context refers to disruption, not destruction. A bright object nearing Earth could alter atmospheric conditions, influence weather patterns temporarily, or simply frighten communities unprepared for its appearance. The consequences would depend on the object's size, distance, and composition. Some researchers examined whether volcanic activity or atmospheric phenomena could explain the descriptions. Volcanic eruptions can produce unusual sky colours, long-lasting glows, and dim or reddish light. If such an eruption occurred near the same time as a comet or meteor event, the combination could produce dramatic effects. The tablets rarely specify whether disturbances occurred simultaneously or separately. Without this information, modern interpretations must consider multiple possibilities. Even so, the descriptions that emphasize movement and trailing light align more closely with cometary behavior than with atmospheric disturbances. Another possibility involves long-period comets whose orbits became disrupted. Comets traveling through the outer solar system can experience gravitational interactions that alter their paths. A small shift could prevent a future return. If a bright comet once passed near Earth but its orbit changed afterward, the event would appear in ancient records but never reoccur. This scenario fits well with the idea of a missing event described in clay. Modern astronomers also consider the influence of biases in ancient observation. The scribes wrote with cultural frameworks that influenced how they described events. A bright comet might appear larger or more intense in their descriptions because of its cultural significance. A meteor burst might be described as lasting longer than it actually did. These exaggerations complicate attempts to match descriptions to real phenomena. Even so, the underlying structure of the observations remains recognizable enough to support scientific analysis. The tension between skepticism and acceptance mirrors the tension within the ancient tablets themselves. The scribes preserved observations with clarity while interpreting them through meaning. Modern researchers must navigate the same balance. The clay preserves information without filtering it through modern scientific assumptions. The challenge lies in understanding how much of the description reflects real observation and how much reflects cultural interpretation. Despite the challenges, the idea of a missing cosmic event remains compelling. The consistency across multiple tablets suggests that the scribes were not recording isolated imagination. They were attempting to preserve knowledge inherited from earlier generations. They believed the sky contained patterns that extended across long intervals. If an event occurred once, they assumed it could return, even if the return was far beyond their lifetimes. This belief shaped how later astronomers approached the ancient records. They recognized that the tablets captured information spanning centuries. They saw that the scribes documented not only what they saw, but what earlier observers had seen. This accumulation created a long-term record that modern researchers can analyze with tools unavailable to the ancient world. The search for the missing catastrophe continues in small steps. Astronomers compare the tablets with modern comet databases. They analyze descriptions of brightness to estimate magnitude. They examine references to duration to estimate orbital behavior. They study lunar and solar disturbances to identify possible correlations with known eclipse cycles. Each step brings the possibility of identifying the event closer, even if definitive answers remain elusive. The puzzle persists because the clay preserves more than information. It preserves a sense of expectation. The scribes believed that the sky operated through cycles, and that some disturbances followed paths too long for any one generation to witness twice. This belief survives in the tablets. Modern astronomers, reading these ancient lines, encounter an echo of that expectation. They recognize that the universe contains objects with orbital periods longer than recorded history. Earth has encountered them before. It may encounter them again. As this narrative continues, the next stage moves toward those who lived between belief and uncertainty. The story turns toward the scholars who debated how to interpret the ancient lines, the skeptics who demanded clarity, and the observers who maintained that the clay preserved more than symbolic meaning. The next part follows the tension between tradition and inquiry, and how it shaped the space between what was known and what remained possible. Long before modern science began measuring the orbits of distant objects, and long before mathematical models could calculate the movement of bodies through space, early observers in Mesopotamia grappled with a challenge that still lingers today. They lived in a world where memory, tradition, and observation coexisted without forming clear boundaries. When an unusual event appeared in the sky, the moment entered the clay with the weight of significance. The event might have been a comet bright enough to dominate the horizon, or a disturbance that shifted the colours of the night, or a long-tailed object hovering above the world for days. Whatever the event was, the record that preserved it blended description and meaning so closely that later readers faced difficulty determining which element had shaped the entry more strongly. This blending produced a unique problem for those who came after. If the tablets preserved a real cosmic event, they preserved it in a form that relied on cultural frameworks rather than modern scientific standards. Yet if the tablets contained symbolic narratives, they still preserved something shaped by the memory of earlier generations. In both cases, the clay offered continuity. It carried words from one era into another, storing ideas that outlasted the people who created them. As scholars and astronomers studied these tablets in later centuries, they encountered entries that hinted at something larger than isolated observations. Some lines describe disturbances that appeared to echo earlier descriptions found elsewhere. They mentioned brightness that resembled earlier accounts, movement that paralleled older lines, or lingering effects that carried the same phrases used in distant periods. These similarities created a sense of continuity across centuries. Even if the events were not identical, the description suggested a pattern of interpretation that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The possibility that the tablets preserved a long-term warning grew slowly from these similarities. It did not emerge from a single entry. It emerged from the accumulated effect of multiple entries placed beside one another across time. When readers compared them, they noticed recurring themes. They saw references to unusual visitors that seemed to arrive unexpectedly. They saw comments about long intervals between disturbances. They saw descriptions that implied a belief in cycles too vast for any one lifetime to witness. These elements created a sense that the tablets might reflect a memory passed between generations. The idea that a warning could survive across ages does not require deliberate intent. It requires only that repeated copying preserves certain entries long enough for them to influence later interpretation. The scribes who copied the omen text did not choose which entries would become important in later eras. They copied material inherited from their predecessors. Their goal was preservation, not prediction. Yet through this preservation, they ensured that certain descriptions remained available to future readers who interpreted them according to their own needs and beliefs. This process becomes clear when examining the structure of the Long Omen series. Many entries describe ordinary events that appear often. Others describe rare or unusual disturbances. The rare entries stand out because they appear less frequently and carry more dramatic details. These entries gained weight simply because they represented uncommon experiences. Later, scribes treated them with additional seriousness, not because they understood the event more clearly, but because the rarity suggested exceptional significance. As the entries passed through time, this significance strengthened. Eventually, the rare entries formed the basis for the belief that earlier generations had preserved a warning of something that had not yet happened. Probability played a role in this belief. People who lived close to the forces of nature understood that unpredictable events could occur without warning. Floods arrived suddenly. Storms developed rapidly. Earthquakes struck without visible cause. In such an environment, the idea that the sky could deliver sudden disturbances felt natural. If a bright visitor appeared without warning, the event became a reminder of the unpredictability of the world. If another visitor appeared centuries later, even if unrelated, the coincidence strengthened the perception of a pattern. When enough such coincidences accumulated, they formed a framework that encouraged people to believe that the sky operated through long-term cycles. Once that belief existed, it shaped how people interpreted earlier records. They no longer saw the rare events as isolated incidents. They saw them as part of a sequence. If the sequence appeared incomplete, the conclusion was simple. The missing event had not yet arrived. The clay did not need to describe the missing event directly. The absence spoke through the structure of the tradition. Later scholars interpreted this silence as a gap waiting to be filled. This dynamic created a space between probability and prophecy. The tablets preserved events that likely occurred, described by observers who witnessed them as best they could. These real events carried enough weight to become symbols. The symbols gained meaning through copying. Meaning influenced later interpretation. Interpretation created expectation. When expectation extended far enough, it began to resemble prophecy, even if no original scribe had intended to predict anything. The question then shifts to whether a warning shaped this way could remain intact across ages. The answer lies in the durability of the clay and the continuity of the omen tradition. The clay did not decay quickly. The tablets buried beneath layers of earth remained intact for millennia. Even when tablets cracked or eroded, many remained legible enough for scholars to reconstruct. The omen tradition ensured that the entries were copied repeatedly. Each generation of scribes preserved material from earlier eras, ensuring that the most intriguing or dramatic entries remained part of the corpus. This continuity allowed the idea of a warning to survive without requiring a conscious effort to preserve prediction. The tablets simply preserved information. The meaning attached to that information changed over time. Once the idea of a cycle existed, the records of earlier events created anticipation. Anticipation required only minimal reinforcement. A single unusual visitor could revive interest in older entries. When scribes compared new events with old descriptions, they often noticed similarities that strengthened the belief in long-term cycles. This belief created a pathway through which meaning could move from one era to another. The potential for a warning to survive this way grows even stronger when considering how cultures interpreted inherited knowledge. Later civilizations often viewed earlier eras as having possessed wisdom lost to their own time. Ancient records carried authority because they came from a distant past. This authority allowed entries to survive even when the surrounding culture changed dramatically. When later scribes encountered descriptions of unusual visitors or disturbances that seemed larger than typical events, they assumed the earlier observers had witnessed something significant. They preserved these entries even if they did not fully understand them. Over time, these entries became detached from their original context. Without clear dates or explanations, the descriptions took on a timeless quality. They could represent events from centuries earlier or anticipate events centuries in the future. This timelessness strengthened the idea of a warning. A warning must remain relevant across long periods. The entries preserved in clay fit this requirement simply by existing outside a precise timeline. The absence of context allowed them to be interpreted as messages from a world that saw more than it understood and sought to preserve what it had witnessed. Probability also plays a major role in understanding how such a warning might reflect real events. Large cosmic disturbances do not occur often within human timescales, yet they occur often within geological timescales. The gap between these scales creates the possibility that an early civilization may have witnessed a rare event that modern researchers have no physical evidence for. A bright visitor with an unusual orbit, a comet passing close enough to alter atmospheric conditions, or a meteor burst with energy high enough to imprint itself on cultural memory, could all occur without leaving traces detectable thousands of years later. If such an event occurred once, it could easily become the basis for long-term expectation. A single bright visitor that frightened a community could turn into a legend. The legend could become an omen. The omen could become part of a cycle. The cycle could extend into the future. When the event failed to repeat, the absence could itself create meaning. People might assume the visitor would return eventually. They might see the lack of repetition as part of a longer pattern. This interpretation would survive as long as the clay preserved the original description. Some modern scholars argue that the tablets may preserve echoes of real events that have not reappeared. These events may not have been catastrophic, but they may have been dramatic enough to leave a lasting impression. A comet passing unusually close to Earth could produce intense light, changes in atmospheric conditions, and a prolonged period of visibility. The cultural impact of such an event would be significant. The memory could persist for centuries. If scribes preserved descriptions of the event in the omen tradition, they might unintentionally preserve a warning without knowing whether the event would ever repeat. This idea grows more compelling when considering how the Sumerians and later Mesopotamian cultures handled the relationship between observation and meaning. They did not treat the two as separate categories. They blended them naturally. Observation provided the raw material, meaning provided structure. When meaning extended across generations, it created continuity. This continuity allowed descriptions of real events to transform into symbols that survived long after the original context faded. Prophecy emerges in this environment not through deliberate prediction, but through the persistence of expectation. The expectation arises from perceived cycles. The cycles arise from records preserved in clay. The clay survives for millennia. Through this chain of preservation, a warning can endure even if the original scribe had no intention of predicting anything. The clay carries the memory. The tradition supplies the structure. Later scholars supply the interpretation. The puzzle deepens when modern researchers attempt to determine whether any of these preserved descriptions correspond to real events that have not repeated. The absence of physical evidence leaves multiple possibilities open. A comet with a highly eccentric orbit may still be travelling far from the inner solar system. A meteor burst with unusual energy may have occurred in a region where physical traces vanish through erosion. An atmospheric disturbance caused by an unknown source may have left no origin to study. Each of these possibilities allows for an event that could inspire a warning without repeating within recorded history. The survival of the warning depends only on the continued copying of the entry. As long as the scribes preserved the description, the warning endured. The meaning attached to it evolved, sometimes pointing toward the future rather than the past. This forward-looking interpretation created the sense that earlier civilizations may have predicted something that has not yet occurred. The tension between probability and prophecy shapes the space where these questions linger. Probability acknowledges that rare events can occur without repeating within predictable intervals. Prophecy emerges when cultural interpretation fills the gap created by limited evidence. The tablets exist in this space. They preserve entries that may reflect real events beyond modern comprehension, transformed through centuries of meaning into something larger than observation alone. As this narrative continues, the next part turns toward the growing weight of these interpretations. It follows how the absence of repetition created new concerns, how traditions carried the expectation of a future event, and how later readers examine the sky with a sense that something preserved in ancient clay might still lie ahead, waiting for its moment to return. Modern life moves forward under an assumption so steady that most people never consider its foundation. The assumption is that the sky behaves with a stability that makes long-term life possible. Observatories track known objects, space agencies monitor potential threats, scientists calculate the orbits of comets with long periods, projecting their paths centuries into the future. The night sky seems predictable enough to fade into the background of daily life. Even when bright objects appear, they usually arrive without causing disruption. They pass overhead, display their beauty, and vanish into the shadows of vast orbits. Yet the ancient tablets from Sumer carry another perspective. They suggest that earlier civilizations lived with a sense of a sky that might deliver surprises beyond the ordinary. They preserve descriptions of visitors intense enough to reshape expectations. They kept records of events so rare that later scribes treated them as part of long cycles. These cycles did not match known patterns. They hinted at something that had not returned. That lingering absence forms the basis of what some modern researchers call the prediction, a term meant to capture the idea that early observers may have witnessed a large cosmic event that has not repeated within recorded history. If that prediction reflects a real event preserved in clay rather than a symbolic construct, the implications extend beyond archaeology. They stretch into the ways modern societies understand risk, probability, and the continuity of the natural world. The idea does not need to involve disaster to carry weight. It involves the possibility that the sky may contain long-term patterns, too subtle for modern science to track with certainty. It suggests that at least one dramatic visitor once passed close to Earth, leaving an impression strong enough to remain alive across generations. The significance lies not in fear, but in perspective. The ancient world may have witnessed something extraordinary that modern observers have not. Considering what such a prediction would mean for the present requires stepping into the shared space between ancient expectation and modern data. Today's astronomers can detect thousands of near-Earth objects, track their orbits with remarkable precision, and estimate their future positions. These capabilities reduce uncertainty for many types of cosmic visitors. They show that most large objects follow paths that do not threaten Earth. Yet the same tools also reveal how little is known about the outer regions of the solar system. Many long-period comets complete their orbits across timescales, too vast for modern science to observe directly. A comet that appeared once in ancient history could still be travelling along a distant arc, unlikely to return within any predictable time frame. If the Sumerian tablets record an encounter with such a comet, the implication is straightforward. The event was real, yet unrepeated. This possibility does not suggest imminent danger. It suggests that Earth once experienced a close approach that did not result in physical impact, but still produced visual effects significant enough to enter cultural memory. A visitor bright enough to cast shadows at night would leave a lasting impression. A comet passing unusually close could shift atmospheric conditions, alter cloud layers, or create atmospheric scattering intense enough to transform the sky's colours. People living thousands of years ago would have responded to such a sight with deep attention, translating the experience into the symbolic language of their time. If this event occurred once, modern observers may never witness anything similar. The orbit could be so elongated that its return lies far in the future, or the orbit may have shifted through gravitational interactions, sending the object away from Earth permanently. Either scenario would leave the ancient record as the only surviving description. The clay would become the sole evidence, a memory without a modern counterpart. If the prediction reflects an event of this type, the meaning for the present involves more than observational history. It challenges assumptions about the completeness of modern astronomical knowledge. Scientists today map near-Earth objects with impressive accuracy, yet they acknowledge gaps in understanding the farthest regions of the solar system. Comets emerging from distant reservoirs such as the Oort cloud follow paths shaped by forces too weak to detect directly. The long-term dynamics of these objects include uncertainties that span thousands of years. Earth could have encountered a rare visitor without modern science recognizing its orbit today. The idea also encourages a reconsideration of how ancient cultures engaged with complexity. The Sumerians lacked telescopes, calculus, and orbital mechanics, yet they documented events that demonstrate careful observation. This suggests that ancient societies were more attuned to environmental and celestial irregularities than often assumed. If they recorded a dramatic event, their description likely reflects something real. The blending of meaning with observation does not erase the underlying experience. It simply shaped how it was preserved. If the prediction was real, another implication emerges. Ancient societies may have carried forward a record of a cosmic event across many centuries without losing the essential memory. The omen tradition demonstrates this capacity. The scribes preserve material from eras they never witnessed, treating each entry as part of a continuous heritage. This continuity reveals that ancient societies valued long-term knowledge deeply. They understood that some events required preservation, even if their meaning was uncertain. The clay became a bridge across which memories could move, gaining new interpretations while retaining core details. For modern readers, this endurance of memory serves as a reminder that rare events can influence human culture long after the physical evidence disappears. A bright comet, a large meteor burst, or a dramatic atmospheric disturbance can reshape belief systems. These events may appear only once in many generations, yet they create narratives that persist. Ancient societies embedded these narratives in rituals, omens, and stories. Modern societies embed them in scientific models and monitoring systems. The forms differ, but the underlying impulse remains: to understand and anticipate forces that operate beyond the scale of daily life. Another implication lies in the relationship between meaning and uncertainty. The ancient record demonstrates how societies respond to limited information by creating interpretive frameworks. These frameworks provide stability in the face of unpredictable events. Modern science provides its own frameworks, rooted in measurement, mathematics, and observation. Yet uncertainty remains. The cosmos contains variables that lie beyond current understanding. A rare event from the ancient world could fall into this category, not because modern science is inadequate, but because the timescale of the cosmos extends far beyond the timescale of human observation. If the prediction described in the Sumerian tablets was real, modern understanding of risk must account for events that occur infrequently enough to fall outside predictable cycles. This does not imply danger. It simply acknowledges that Earth moves through an environment filled with objects whose paths span enormous distances and enormous times. A rare visitor may pass close once and never return. The ancient record may reflect such an encounter. Exploring what this would mean for modern society brings forward another dimension. People today live in an environment shaped by technology, interconnected systems, and rapid communication. An unusual cosmic event, even one without physical impact, would attract global attention. A bright comet with unusual behavior would generate images shared across the world. A meteor burst producing intense atmospheric effects would be recorded from multiple angles. Modern tools would document every detail, transforming the event into a data set rather than a memory preserved through clay and tradition. If the Sumerian prediction described a real event, the modern world would approach it differently. Scientific institutions would measure it. Space agencies would track it. Observatories would analyze it. The event would be placed into context immediately. It would become part of the ongoing effort to understand the universe's long cycles. The symbolic meaning that ancient societies attached to such disturbances would be replaced by data, models, and probabilities. Yet the emotional response might remain similar. Rare cosmic events still carry the power to reshape perspective. They remind people of the vastness beyond Earth and of forces that operate independently of human activity. The idea of a real ancient event also influences how researchers interpret long-term cultural memory. Societies often preserve memories of rare natural events in stories, rituals, and traditions. These memories can survive even when the physical cause is forgotten. The tablets from Sumer serve as an example of how written records can preserve these memories across millennia. If the prediction reflects a real event, it demonstrates the remarkable ability of early civilizations to transmit knowledge across time. This transmission occurred not through deliberate forecasting, but through careful documentation and continuous copying. Modern readers benefit from this continuity. The clay provides insight into how ancient people interpreted their environment. It reveals the complexity of their understanding and the depth of their observational practices. If the prediction was real, it highlights their ability to recognize the significance of rare events and to preserve those events in a form that outlasted their own societies. The significance for the present lies not in the possibility of an imminent event, but in the recognition that the universe contains long-term rhythms beyond current measurement. Ancient people lived with this awareness instinctively. Modern society often forgets it due to the stability created by scientific understanding. The ancient record serves as a reminder that the cosmos contains surprises. This reminder does not create fear. It creates humility. It connects the present with the distant past through shared curiosity and shared experience. If the prediction was real, it also underscores the value of studying ancient records with openness. The tablets contain layers of meaning formed across centuries. They preserve clues about the environment, the sky, and the natural world. Interpreting them requires understanding the worldview of the people who created them. It requires seeing observation and meaning as intertwined rather than separate. This perspective allows modern researchers to approach the tablets with greater nuance, recognizing that symbolic language often contains echoes of real events. The possibility of a real ancient event that is not repeated also illustrates the limits of current assumptions. Modern astronomy operates with powerful tools, yet it remains constrained by the length of recorded history. Comets with extremely long periods cannot be fully understood until they return. Objects that pass near Earth once may not leave detectable traces. Ancient records can extend the observational timeline by preserving descriptions from thousands of years ago. These descriptions can complement modern data, providing a foundation for understanding long-term behavior in the solar system. As the narrative moves toward its closing stage, the final part leads gently into the space between ancient memory and modern quiet. It follows how the weight of possibility settles into the present, not as fear, but as reflection, shaping the way people think about the sky, the passing of ages, and the enduring connection between what was seen thousands of years ago and what might still unfold in the far horizon that stretches ahead. The idea of a missing event preserved through clay and carried across ages by scribes who never saw the original moment settles into the present in a way that does not demand urgency. It does not press forward with expectation or prediction. It rests quietly in the background, like a detail remembered without fully understanding why it stayed familiar for so long. The story lives through the tablets, but the weight it carries now is shaped more by reflection than warning. The modern world turns without the constant awareness that earlier civilizations carried, yet the sky remains the same expanse that once made ancient observers pause each night to look upward, searching for signs that connected their own lives with a larger rhythm. During most nights, the sky stretches in stillness. Lights shift slowly. Stars rise and set in measured patterns. Planets trace their long paths without sudden change. This familiar stability does more than comfort those who study the heavens. It shapes the foundation of everyday life. People move through their days with the assurance that the environment above them will remain consistent. This steadiness gives the world its sense of scale. It creates the conditions in which long-term planning becomes possible. Yet beneath this steadiness lies the faint trail of memory preserved through the tablets, a reminder that the sky can produce moments rare enough that they reshape understanding for generations. The story of the missing event echoes quietly through this contrast. Ancient people lived close to uncertainty. They understood that the world around them could shift without warning. This awareness allowed them to notice when the sky diverged from familiar patterns. They recognized the significance of bright visitors that did not fit within known cycles. They saw unusual shadows and long trails of light. They responded to these moments by preserving what they saw with as much clarity as their world allowed. The clay captured these experiences and carried them into the present, where they blend with modern scientific knowledge in ways neither side fully anticipated. The calm that fills the night sky today does not erase those earlier experiences. Instead, it sits alongside them. The story echoes because it represents a continuation rather than a separation. The people who wrote the tablets lived under the same sky. They observed the same stars. They tracked the same long arcs of planets. The difference lies in the tools and the frameworks available to interpret what they saw. Yet the act of looking upward remains unchanged. The impulse to understand remains unchanged. The desire to place meaning within the vastness remains unchanged. When modern readers encounter the ancient descriptions of bright visitors or unexplained disturbances, they encounter not only the event itself, but the experience of early civilizations trying to make sense of something extraordinary. This experience resonates because it reflects a shared human tendency to seek patterns in the unknown. The echo that persists comes not from the event alone, but from the act of recording it, the act of noticing that something unusual had entered the world. The scribes who pressed the symbols into clay may not have intended their work to reach beyond their own community or era, yet the permanence of their medium allowed their observations to survive well beyond their time. The durability of these tablets contributes to the quiet resonance that lingers now. The clay outlasted the walls built around it, the cities that shaped the culture, and the people who created the symbols. It remained intact through floods, collapses, and the slow movement of earth that buried entire civilizations. When scholars eventually uncovered the tablets, they found a world still present in the impressions left behind. The symbols carried a sense of immediacy even after thousands of years. This endurance allows modern readers to share a connection with ancient observers, creating a continuity that exists independently of scientific development or cultural change. The story echoes because the sky still contains unknowns. Modern science has mapped much of the solar system. It has predicted the movements of thousands of objects, tracked comets with extraordinary precision, and measured the faint light from distant bodies. Yet beyond these achievements lies a space shaped by intervals too long for current observation. Long-period comets remain largely unknown. Distant objects drift along paths humans have not yet mapped. These uncertainties mirror, in a faint way, the uncertainties that ancient people lived with every night. The echo persists because the ancient records remind modern readers that the sky has produced rare events before. These events may not repeat within a single lifetime or even across many generations. Their absence does not diminish their existence. The tablets serve as documentation that the sky once behaved in ways that left entire communities searching for meaning. The memory of that search continues. It shapes how people think about long-term cycles, distant objects, and the possibility that the universe contains surprises that unfold across intervals longer than human history. This quiet awareness creates a sense of perspective rather than fear. The ancient story does not suggest that something dramatic is expected soon. It suggests instead that humanity exists within a world larger than the immediate moment. The sky above carries traces of events that predate modern understanding. It contains objects moving along vast paths shaped by forces too distant to observe fully. The story echoes because it connects the present with a timeline that extends far beyond recorded history, reminding readers that the world is shaped by rhythms both familiar and unknown. The idea of a missing event preserved in clay gains influence not through urgency, but through patience. The tablets reflect a civilization that understood the value of long-term knowledge. They show that early societies cared deeply about preserving information for future generations. The scribes did not know how far into the future their records would travel. They simply understood that what they witnessed mattered enough to preserve. That sense of importance resonates today because it reflects a shared human instinct to document the extraordinary. This instinct carries into the modern world through scientific observation. Data replaces clay. Telescopes replace the open sky. Models replace symbolic interpretation. Yet the foundation remains the same. The desire to record, understand, and pass knowledge forward connects the ancient past with the present. The echo of the story continues because the motivation behind the record remains recognizably human. The tablets and the data serve the same purpose, to create continuity across time. The story also echoes because it invites reflection on the nature of prediction. Ancient scribes did not intend to forecast the future in the modern sense. They preserved entries based on the belief that the sky operated through cycles. These cycles did not require precise calculation. They required continuity. When a rare event appeared, the scribes assumed it belonged to a larger pattern. If the event did not repeat within living memory, the assumption did not weaken. It simply extended the expected interval. This extension allowed the story to travel beyond the era that produced it. Modern readers encounter this extension as a question of interpretation, yet the story persists because it reflects a universal understanding that some events exceed the scale of ordinary time. The ancient world recognized this instinctively. They created frameworks to preserve rare experiences even when their origins faded into distant memory. This approach allowed the story to maintain its shape across ages, surviving through meaning rather than calculation. The echo that remains now does not arise from fear or anticipation. It arises from the recognition that humanity has always lived with a mixture of knowledge and uncertainty. The tablets remind modern readers that ancient societies operated with clarity in some areas and uncertainty in others. They observed the sky closely and recorded what they saw, but they interpreted these moments through their cultural frameworks. Modern societies do the same, though the frameworks differ. The continuity lies in the interplay between observation and meaning. The story also carries a quiet emotional resonance. Ancient people lived under the open sky without modern distractions or artificial light. Nights extended across hours of clear visibility. The stars appeared more vivid. The paths of planets were easier to follow. When a rare visitor arrived, the experience could reshape a community's understanding of the world. The tablets preserve not just the event, but the sense of attention that surrounded it. Modern readers can imagine that attention. Even though modern cities soften the night sky with bright lights, the memory of a world illuminated only by natural light remains familiar. The echo continues because the story represents a shared human relationship with the unknown. When people look at the night sky today, they see points of light separated by unimaginable distances. When ancient people looked at the sky, they saw symbols that guided their understanding of seasons, cycles, and meaning. Both perspectives arise from the same impulse. The sky invites curiosity. It draws attention outward. It encourages reflection on a scale larger than daily concerns. The possibility that the tablets preserve a real event that is not repeated adds another layer to this connection. It suggests that the sky once displayed something extraordinary, something that left an imprint strong enough to survive through clay across thousands of years. The echo of that event persists not because anyone expects it to return, but because it demonstrates how long human memory can extend when preserved through careful documentation. The tablets show that ancient societies understood the importance of capturing experiences that fell outside ordinary life. They recognized the value of preserving rare moments even when their meaning remained uncertain. This recognition created a chain of memory that extends into the present. The echo that lingers now does not call for interpretation or anticipation. It simply calls for awareness. The sky has held surprises before. It may hold them again. The ancient record serves as a reminder that humanity exists within a dynamic universe, shaped by events both familiar and rare. As night settles and the sky reveals its quiet arrangement of lights, the story endures through thought. It continues because people still look upward with a mixture of understanding and mystery. It continues because the ancient tablets preserved a memory shaped by attention rather than certainty. It continues because the sky remains the same place where ancient observers once stood, watching, recording, and wondering how to carry their experiences into the future. The echo that follows is gentle. It carries no urgency. It carries no demand. It settles into the rhythm of night and finds its place within the long continuity that stretches from the earlier cities to the present day. It offers a reminder that humanity's connection to the cosmos has always been shaped by curiosity, preservation, and the quiet awareness that some stories last not because they predict anything, but because they reflect the enduring impulse to understand a sky that continues to expand above every generation that has ever lived beneath it.